Evening, everyone. Welcome to this public hearing of the Charter Revision Commission. My name is Richard Geary. I have the honor of chairing this commission. And we are here as New York City celebrates its 400th anniversary to take a fresh look at our city's governing charter. Our goal is how to make sure that we can ensure that New York City remains a freedom of opportunity, as it was for my parents when they immigrated to this country from Panama. There we go. I appreciate them together. And they inherited with their stones there. We want to really think about how we can provide the charter to make sure it's an effective tool for building a more inclusive New York and more affordable New York. So as folks know, it is the commission's responsibility to review the entire charter and to suggest changes to the vote for the voters' consideration. The recommendations we make are recommendations. Only those changes that the voters agree to will go into effect. And I know that my fellow commissioners, when I say that we are truly committed to hearing from a broad spectrum of New Yorkers and pursuing the best ideas we can find. This is one of several public hearings we're going to have in every borough. And our hope is to hear from experts, community leaders, elected officials, and indeed any member of the public who wishes to testify. And I will also reinforce that this is an independent commission. In making our recommendations to the city's voters, we are bound only by our judgment and our values. We'll pursue ideas regardless of who propose them and regardless of who supports them. Joining me in this task are 12 other commissioners: Vice Chair Sharon Greenberger, Secretary Lima Boulevard, Grace Bonilla, Shannon DeBaron, Anita Lerma, Dr. Lizette Nieves, Anthony Richardson, Julie Samuels, Diane Savino, Carl Weisbrod, Valerie White, and Catherine Lott. As I said, it is our responsibility to look at the entire charter, and today we will hear from New Yorkers on a variety of topics. So let me explain how the hearing will unfold. First, we will hear from invited panelists. Each panelist was asked to testify for no longer than 5 minutes. Give or take a second or two, after which will be followed by questions from the commissioners. What we may try to do is let all the panelists take a speak and then ask both of you questions. After that, we will hear from the people two panelists speaking. And after that, we will hear from members of the public. We will ask members of the public to testify for no more than 3 minutes, followed by questions from the commission. And similarly, we will ask members of the public to come up in groups. We'll hear from them, and then we'll ask the panel and we'll get the commission. We will first hear from those who attended the meeting in person. We also have an online sign up for those who are attending by Zoom. If you wish to testify virtually, there is a form online that you can find at nyc.gov/charter. That's nyc.gov/charter. You then click on the meetings tab and select the Queen's hearing. You should find the sign up sheet there. I believe someone will also drop that link into the chat. We're going to try our best to hear from everyone, although we are scheduled to run until 8 p.m. So I'll ask everyone who will testify and be mindful of the clock when asking questions and answering them. And if for some reason we don't get to you, I will remind you all that there are many ways to submit your testimony. You can attend another hearing, or you can visit, you can find all the hearing information at nyc.gov/charter. You can also submit written testimony at any time at chartertestimony@citycharter.nyc.gov. That is chartertestimony@citycharter.nyc.gov, and we'll review all written testimony. All of our hearings, of course, are live streamed if you cannot be here in public, and they're recorded and available for archival purposes. So before we begin with testimony, I would ask commissioners for a motion to approve the minutes from our February 11th hearing. Can I have a second? Any discussion on this one? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Abstentions? All right, the minutes are adopted. Thank you. With that, we'll start our testimony. We're joined first by Louisa Chafin, Director of the Independent Budget Office. And we'll get first of all here from Lawrence Chiliano. Get on switch.
Now, can you hear me? Even closer.
Move it.
Okay, good evening, Chair Yuri, Vice Chair Greenberger, Executive Director Sherenbach, members of the Commission, I'm Louisa Chafee, I'm the Director of the New York City Independent Budget Office. And I'm joined by my colleague, Sarita Subramanian, the Chief Research and Strategy Officer. IBO is an independent government agency mandated by the New York City Charter. I'm pleased to testify on our 3 top priorities. My complete testimony is submitted. The first thing I'd like to talk about are rules on the rainy day funds. So given the federal landscape, IBO suggests strengthening the city's budgetary framework by moving more protections from the state's Financial Emergency Act into the charter and by tightening charter provisions concerning reserve accounts. IBO supports charter language, requiring more details on transparency, usage, and implementation of all of the city's reserve accounts. And IBO also encourages ensuring that all relevant information is made available to enable city fiscal monitors, including IBO, to analyze the city's budget and fiscal health. The second area I'd like to talk about is procurement. In fiscal 2024, contract-based spending exceeded 34 billion out of the total budget of 111 billion. Most government services for vulnerable New Yorkers are provided by nonprofit providers whose financial stability depends on timely payment on their city contracts. As any household knows, sound fiscal management means paying one's bills on time, and yet the city often does not. So why are the bills not paid on time? One reason is that the contract with the nonprofit provider ends and the city agency does not complete the new RFP and/or contract on time. Meanwhile, the city agency expects services to continue uninterrupted, even though it knows the payment will stop until the new contract is in place. Now, city data shows that RFPs post-award take between 90 and 150 days to complete, whereas contract extensions take 34 days. Therefore, IBO suggests that the commission consider mandating that the Procurement Policy Board, that's the charter-created regulatory body overseeing procurement, make an automatic rule requiring agencies to process extension contracts for their existing vendors whenever agencies are unable to begin that final step of the RFP processing at least 6 months prior to the end of the existing contract. And here I'd just like to give a shout out to the Fund for the City of New York, that is one of the few entities that actually provides assistance to nonprofits while they are in the predicament of waiting for their contracts to be registered. Next, I'd like to talk about delayed invoicing, because even once the contracts are registered, late payments often occur. Generally, the city agency holds up the entire payment, even though the bulk of the invoice is undisputed. Again, the PPB has authority, though not a mandate, to address the timeliness of invoicing payments. This commission could mandate the PPB to establish rules that require city agencies to pay at a defined time a certain percentage for each invoice from a human service contractor in good standing. City agencies could then resolve the disputed portions of invoices within a longer mandated timeframe without putting the fiscal stability of their nonprofit partners at risk. Other contracting changes to ensure real accountability. The Mayor's Office of Contract Services should be established in the charter, similar to the Office of Management and Budget and Operations. And IBO strongly encourages limiting the use of emergency contracting by requiring that the mayor and the controller renew their joint determination that the emergency procurement remains appropriate once such contract has been in place for 2 years. That is an issue that was highly contentious during the asylum seeker search. And lastly, I'd like to talk about enhancing the city's budget structure to promote transparency. When the city council adopts the budget, it authorizes spending in categories termed units of appropriation, UAs. The UA is charter defined and intended to reflect the budget for a particular program, purpose, activity, or institution. Quote, in practice, this is not working. For example, DIFTA has home delivered meals, home care, and older adult centers in a single UA. NYCD has after-school adult literacy and assistance to immigrants. One UA, the Department of Education places 23% of the agency's $33 billion budget, that's $8 billion, in a single UA entitled General Education Instruction and School Leadership. And my favorite, NYPD places 123 police precincts, all of them, borough-wide offices, detective works, forensic investigation, narcotics, and strategic response in a single UA with a budget of 1.6 billion. That's 25% of the 6.4 billion agency budget with fiscal year 2025 as the example. So what's the issue? City council can't do oversight because the UAs don't give enough granularity, and anyone trying to understand the budget cannot separate out the programs. So new UAs may be added each year as part of the budget negotiations, but there has not been a systematic approach to the dual challenges of ensuring transparency and managerial flexibility. Thus, IBO calls upon the commission to refine the description of units of appropriation. UA should be distinct when an agency's programs serve different kinds of New Yorkers or provide different kinds of services. And there should be a percentage limit on the UA in relationship to the budget. Such changes will truly enable the budget, the public to identify how each program is funded, give transparency, and improve effective oversight. In conclusion, IBO welcomes the opportunity to work with you and your staff around these and other exciting issues addressing financial responsibility and increasing transparency. I'm available for questions, or I'm happy to meet in the following weeks. Thank you.
Ms. JB, the issue of tardy or late or non-payments finally to not-for-profits has been an issue as far back as I can remember, going back at least to the Koch administration, maybe further than that. It was improved somewhat in the Koch administration by shaming the agencies to submit their vouchers in a timely way. But it has gotten a lot worse, and we, as you may know, considered this issue closely in a 2019 charter. And yet it's spiked in the last few years even more. I'm a little leery about how much of this issue is a charter issue to solve and how much of it is simply sort of management incompetence.
I would say it's a combination of both. In the Bloomberg years, I had the pleasure of working on procurement for 8 years and looking very closely at human service procurement. So we went up to about 90% timely payment, which we thought wasn't good enough and is significantly better than what we're seeing now. And that was intense management drive. It's one of the reasons why we're suggesting the Mayor's Office of Contract Services should be elevated so that they have the same level charter status. There are IT improvements, but not an IT system, in my experience, having led HHS Accelerator, cannot solve the problem. It needs to be a combination of management and commitment and IT enabling the process, as it is an enormous network of payments.
Why, just to follow up, why is it that over the years, the same agencies are the same tardy agencies to submit their vouchers in time to start the process? And even though they're pulled out for tension, it never really seems to improve.
I would say that the agencies do fluctuate. Sometimes they're really good and sometimes they're not. And I'd be happy to discuss who's good and who's bad. I mean, it's transparent, but there have been agencies that have done very well and then 2 years later have done very badly. So, but I think the fundamental issue has to do with the procurement process is complex and time consuming, and there needs to be management attention and an elevation that this is critical to the operation of business operations for the city.
Two questions. Two questions to follow up. Questions. One is, you talk about elevating costs to a charter agency. Are there particular responsibilities full roles that you would give to Mox as part of that? Or would it just an elevation of the charter? And the second question, maybe an also related to this, just around accountability, which is, are there particular, are there accountability mechanisms that you build into the city when it fails to present in a timely manner that might facilitate?
The mayor's office operations is charter mandated to produce the mayor's management report. I would argue that there would be merit for the mayor's office of contract services to produce a parallel procurement management report, which would basically highlight how the commitments of the administration were being delivered for procurement across multiple industries. There are pockets of that now, for example, in WBE reporting, but it's not comprehensive. Apart from that, I would codify what's basically an executive order. That was the first part. Second part of the question is, what's the consequence of not
To
paying?
the city, should there be consequences?
Well, there's debate that there should be the ability in other sectors, if providers are not paid, they simply do not perform services. So for example, in construction in the city, if the city hasn't registered the contract, the service doesn't begin. Nonprofit providers do begin. That's why we're encouraging the language in the charter to make it clear that the work may not begin until the contract is registered.
Question about the UAs. I mean, you talked about sort of how you would increase flexibility within that, and this may be too long of an answer to supply now, but would you think about and come back to us with how you would do that without increasing bureaucracy on a tenfold basis?
Right. I mean, I think there's a sweet spot between super granularity and the level, some of the UAs. We call that both the most egregious, but you know, the police department one is an excellent example. But I'm happy to talk more with you about that, as I find UAs extremely interesting.
Thank you, Lisa, for your testimony. Isn't it true that the number of contracts have not kept pace with the number of staff that are processing in every agency?
So we are, the independent budget office is looking really closely at the staffing, which went from approximately 320,000 employees to approximately 200, I'm looking at Serena to get the numbers right, 286,000. And it has, but the reduction in those during the COVID years was completely unsystematic. And there is certainly not a strategic rebuilding, and because of the hiring practices of 2-for-1, etc., there are many both procurement and lawyers and contract managers that haven't been filled appropriately. By coincidence, we're about to produce a report on this, but we don't have as much detail as we'd like to, but we do believe it is an issue.
But looking forward to your report, my question is, as a follow-up, is there something that we could do in the charter to ensure that staffing or systems are keeping pace with the number of contracts the city is taking on?
We'd like to get back to you on that because I
Sure.
think it's tricky to mandate the management. But I think there are things that the PPP could require, so the charter could instruct the PPP to execute.
So Lisa, thanks for what you're stating, as well as thanks for shouting about fun. I would say a couple of things. I'm curious because it's hard to tease apart what are the management issues that you're talking about versus what can be resolved through the charter. I'm just saying, for me. So that's, I want to hear that. And so I'm just going to be honest with that in that transparency where we have a level of transparency where we know what agencies are not completing. Is it, if it's an accountability issue, you know, why would we approach it through the charter? So I just add that, and I'm curious if you could respond to that. That's one. The second thing is you talked about limiting the emergency contracting. Right? From your perspective, what would be considered reasonable emergencies that would allow that to, because I think this is an interesting one about, because yes, in the city, we throw emergency out a lot. So I would love to just kind of hear your thoughts on that.
So there are really specific rules about when an emergency contract is allowed to be used, but there's no time limitation on it currently. So what we're suggesting is not to change the threshold of when the mayor and the controller may decide to enter into an emergency, but rather 2 years in, they simply need to both reaffirm that the emergency still exists. So that the contract, the entered into emergency contract doesn't indefinitely run or is open and could be used for other circumstances that really don't have anything to do with the initial emergency or maybe even an emergency anymore. And the first question was about the distinction between what should be in the charter, what's in the PPB, and what's management. So all we are suggesting is that the charter currently says that the PPB may, and we're suggesting that that language be turned into the PPB will. So that the PPB is given more enforcement ability, so that it must meet, it must execute the responsibilities that the charter believes the PPB to have. As in the current openness, the PPP tends not to meet and not to execute many of the responsibilities that one would expect it to be doing based on charter language.
Commissioner Sabino?
Now it's on. Good to see you, Louisa. I'm very interested, before I get into the two questions I have for you, to talk to you afterwards about the potential report you have on what I call succession planning in government. And it's a challenge both not just for the city of New York, but for the state of New York. How do we encourage people into the government service, into the civil service, and to make a career out of it? It's not quite as attractive as it used to be. When I started 34 years ago, there was certain things that people thought a career in public service was going to provide for you. It's not exactly the same, and I think we're struggling against that, as well as struggling against what I call the world of work is changing. People don't want to be tied down to a job 5 days a week. Some of them are more interested in what they call the gig economy or more of a independent contractors, but that's a conversation for another night. There's two things that you talked about in your testimony that I'm interested in. And you've said it, and I think the answer to some people. The idea of Mox becoming a chartered agency as opposed to just a mayoral agency. I'm not quite sure how making that case, making it a chartered agency is going to make it work any better. So if you could flesh out why you think that would make a profound change in the ability to get nonprofits paid.
I think that it elevates it to a level of importance where there would be more specific hearings, there would be more specific reports forthcoming. As I mentioned to the vice chair, I think the procurement MMR would be very helpful, because I think if you put transparency on issues, people tend to do a better job.
And not to play devil's advocate, but I will. But every agency that Mox has to interact with that issues contracts, you've said yourself, some are better than others. I'm really interested to hear which ones do it better than others, but they're all chartered agencies and they can't seem to figure out how to get people paid once a contract is let.
Right, well, they're different parts. I mean, basically, Mox is the engine that can push the initial contract registration over the finish line. So that's really the intention, to raise the agency so that that initial relationship of the contract being in place before the work starts is executed. The payment is really at the issue of agency level. And so there are two, so my testimony didn't go into that nuance, but the agencies, generally, as many of you know, you submit an invoice and maybe 85% of it is acceptable and 15 isn't, and the entire thing is not accepted until that 15% is resolved. That's at the agency level. And sometimes it's, you know, at a level of staff that doesn't really understand what the consequences are of holding such a payment. I'm sure you occasionally get told because people haven't been paid
All the time.
and they're you know, struggling. So that's why we're suggesting that there should be some for nonprofits in good standing. There should be some level of automatic, once the invoice is submitted, and there's a little bit of nuance as to what's submitted, but once it's in, a certain percentage should be automatically paid. Because the agencies are audited, and so one could pull back after the fact, but it would stop the cash flow issues, which in some of our government agencies put such extreme pressure on providers that, you know, they tap into bank loans and endowments, and, you know, their you know, boards that are or philanthropies, etc., in a way that is not fair. The city's engaging for business, the city should pay for the business it's engaging with.
Thank you. And the last question, so just occurred to me, on the units of appropriation. a lot of people don't understand what that means. The city budget is different than the state budget. And I've often wondered, so on the city level, you have this unit appropriation, it's a large amount of money to an agency. We all talk about the NYPD, they have the largest unit appropriation. Does it line out what they're supposed to spend that money? So are you suggesting that similar to what's done on the state budget level, where you have, they call it the 8 localities, where every item that the state spends money on is lined out in like one spending bill?
I'm suggesting a sweet point between the two. So there needs to be a balance, and I would advocate a balance between UA is so large that 123 precincts are in there. Versus so granular that if each precinct were in its own, one could imagine it being so granular, it could be very hard from a management perspective. If one needed to move money around or staffing, etc. So there's a level to be found, and my suggestion is that in 1989, when the UAs began, the drafters had a different concept than what we currently have. And particularly with some of the other budget practices that my colleagues are going to address, we're just concerned about circumstances where it's hard to understand some of the nuances because the overall buckets are so enormous.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you so much, Lisa. Next, we'll have a panel. I apologize, we'll have a panel with Lawrence Chiliano of the Legal Aid Society, Fred Schack, CEO of Urban Pathways, and Michelle Jackson, Executive Director of the Human Services Council. Hey, welcome.
Bold to go first, by my peers. Good evening, Chair Bury. Thank you to the commission for having me. I'm Michelle Jackson. I'm the Executive Director of the Human Services Council, a membership association of 180 human service nonprofits in New York City, and we do city and state policy on behalf of the sector. When the members that I have, what they have in common is they all contract overwhelmingly with the city of New York to provide essential human services. You have my written testimony. It's the same as it's been for 15 years. With some updates by smarter people than me and some new ideas, but overwhelmingly, we strike the same note of despite administrations, even with the focus on procurement reform, there has overwhelmingly been a lack of focus and effort on paying providers on time for the services that they provide. And especially now, we see a real sector in crisis. I will not read my whole testimony to you all because there are people who have been at this issue and lived it in a different way much longer than I have. So I just want to highlight a couple of things. First, ditto to what Louisa Tracy said. We absolutely second her recommendation. I think the second thing I want to focus on is the city of yes. When we think about affordable New York, at the end of the day, that's the infrastructure. And I appreciate that there's an insight into focusing on the infrastructure of affordable housing. But the next layer of infrastructure is procurement. And if we don't figure out a way to provide payment on time to human service providers who will do the supportive housing, who will compete for the RFPs, you are going to have good quality providers who are not going to be in business by the time we get that housing upright. And we're not going to have a system that supports all of the services that need to be there for a city of yes to have seniors and have the wraparound services, have supportive housing and the wraparound. So there's a huge connection between procurement reform and paying human service providers on time. You all have the data, but I think it's important to note that just recently, the controller's report noted that 91% of total contracts for human services were registered late last year. That's remarkably late. That means no human service provider should expect a contract on time. And lateness is on contract registration, but it's also which means until the contract is registered, nonprofits can't get paid. But we've also seen, and this is a newer problem, invoicing has been remarkably delayed, and providers are owed not just invoicing, but budget modifications when money is added. Back to FY20, they're still waiting on money to be put into the budget. And so that's why I think what I'll start out of order is recommendation around having MOCs have more authority. MOCs has been able to streamline the procurement process up till payment and invoicing. So if they have more authority to tell city agencies to invoice and pay people in certain ways, there's an opportunity to fix through the charter something that has plagued the sector and the city for a long time. The second is, I do differ from some of my peers, that we do believe there should be time frames for contract registration. The controller's office has 30 days. We've gone a long way of waiting for different administrations to tell us, well, what if we go faster than our timeframes? We would love for them to have timeframes and just work within the timeframes. We don't think it will be 30 days, but the PPB would have authority to establish those timeframes. There was a law that was passed last year at the city, through the city council to show how long it takes for procurement to go, and that would be a good, barometer for to start. But really, contracts need to be registered before the start date. And that's what timeliness means. And that seems like not a revolutionary idea. And yet here we are. Second, we do believe in sticks, and there should be interest. There should be an interest penalty. The state has a contracting law that requires interest to be paid. And their tardiness level is much lower than the cities by having some real teeth behind it that says, providers take out, my members at one moment in time had $78 million in lines of credit and that they were paying interest for. That is unreimbursable on most of their city contracts, which means that's money, $78 million is not going to New Yorkers in need of services. And the city should be covering those costs. And if you put it into the agency lines, then there's an opportunity for them to say, listen, if we can register everything on time, that's money in our budgets to use for other things. So it could be a carrot and a stick. And I mentioned, we also support the charter authority around the Mayor's Office of Contract Services. I think one of the questions that came up here was, what's bad management or mismanagement versus what should be in the charter. And I would just say we've seen different administrations tackle this issue in different ways and have not solved this problem. And in fact, created their own unique ways of doing it. And so these are just a couple of things that could really provide relief to the nonprofit sector and ensure that there's some timeliness going forward. Happy to answer questions. You have my full testimony that has much more fact in it than what I just laid out for you today.
Thank you.
Evening, Chair Bury, Vice Chair Berger, members of the commission. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. My name is Lawrence Esniano. I am the Chief Operating Officer of the Legal Aid Society. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. The Legal Aid Society is the largest nonprofit law firm, and we are part of a coalition of nonprofit public defenders and civil legal services providers in New York City. Collectively, we provide constitutionally, legally mandated representation to hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers each year. We defend people against incarceration, eviction, deportation, and family separation. We connect people to life-saving benefits, housing, and support. We are a lifeline for New Yorkers. The services that we provide are supported by city initiatives and funding. The funds we receive, including through baseline and discretionary contracts and initiatives, including the indirect cost rate, COLA, and workforce enhancement, are essential for us to continue to deliver the services to vulnerable New Yorkers. Without timely access to these contracted funds, we are not able to hire and retain the attorneys, paralegals, investigators, social workers, and others who are critical to do this work. Recent changes from the city, including increasing contract advances, allowance clause amendments, the 3-year COLA initiative, and other changes have been a step in the right direction. But despite these changes, chronic underfunding and mounting contracts and payment delays jeopardize our ability to provide essential services to New Yorkers. Our city contracts, like many nonprofits, are cost-based, which means we only receive reimbursement after services have been delivered. The city's contracting and payment challenges touch every point along the timeline, from RFP to registration to invoicing and payment. Today, I'd like to talk about just 2 examples of the critical issues with the city contracting and payment process that endanger our ability to make a payroll and pay vendors, experts, and rent, and to continue doing this work. These issues are especially dire for smaller nonprofits in our coalition and non-contracts that we subcontract with to deliver essential services. The first issue are delays preventing us from submitting invoices. To just give you one example, in fiscal year 25, for a contract that began July 1st, we were only able to begin submitting invoices in January. That means we had done 6 months of work before we were able to submit invoices. Now, through a lot of lobbying and advocacy with nonprofits that take out high interest loans and lines of credit, we were able to successfully get additional advances to address the issue. But these stopgap measures are extremely challenging and make it impossible to plan and sustain cash flow. The challenges also don't end once we can begin submitting invoices, which is the second issue that I'd like to talk about today. When submitting invoices or budget modifications, we face an incredibly onerous and ever-changing submission and review process just to get reimbursed for the work that was already completed. It involves an extremely detailed line item review, and the process differs greatly from agency to agency, which for organizations like us that have contracts with multiple agencies makes it extremely difficult. This, along with still working to close out invoices from prior years at the same time that you're submitting invoices for the current year, creates really unsustainable issues for our cash flow and uncertainty. I will say more broadly that nonprofits like us start at an extraordinary disadvantage. While city agencies start the year with their funding and routinely receive additional allocations for things like collective bargaining agreements, healthcare cost increases, utility and rent increases, nonprofits like us do not. We are constantly waiting for our funding to be confirmed or even once that work has been completed. And then when we're not able to spend all of the money in our contract because the funding was never confirmed, or we didn't receive it in time, the city takes the funding that we don't spend back, effectively cutting our revenue. Taken together, these issues mean that we cannot access the funding in our contracts or funding intended for us, threatening the ability for nonprofits like us to operate and implement critical city initiatives and support the New York City as opposed to. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight about these issues and look forward to taking questions.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. I want to thank the commission for offering me this opportunity to provide testimony this evening on this critical issue. My name is Frederick Schack. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Urban Pathways, where I've had the privilege of serving for the past 20 years. In addition to my role at Urban Pathways, I'm the co-chair of the Mayor's Advisory Committee to the Mayor's Office of Nonprofit Services. And prior to that, I was the co-chair of the Mayor's Nonprofit Resiliency Committee under the previous administration. For the past decade, more than a decade, I've been working in partnership with the city to try to address the issues around contracting and crop aid, including the work that I did under the previous administration on Accelerator, and more recently working around looking at Passport as a way of expediting payments to our contractors. The reality is that you have heard that the contracting process in the city is broken, fundamentally broken, and it really is the #1 threat to the solvency of the nonprofit sector here in New York City. It is impossible for us to provide these really vital services if we can't rely on a stream of funding from the city, following through on its commitments that it makes to our organizations, its police and pay. So I don't want to spend the rest of my time talking about issues. I really do want to talk about what I think the real solutions are. And I'm going to frame it around 3 things. And you've actually already heard it, probably hear it multiple times. Accountability as being, the critical component of getting this problem fixed. The work that I've done in the past with the city, the reality has been that there have been good intentions, but at the end of the day, there is no accountability for its failure to meet its obligation. If I don't pay my bills, if I don't pay my vendors, a couple of things happen. They terminate services, but I also am subject to late fees and penalties. The city does not have any consequences for its failure to pay. At one point in time during the period where the city was really interested in net zero with its veterans programs, I was approached by the commissioner. They pleaded with me to open up a program. Historically, we've not been able to do that because of the risk associated with it. But because of the urgency at that time, decided, okay, do this. I was promised that within 3 months, my contract. We operated that program to triple net base on the building, providing services to veterans, ending their homelessness for a year and a half before we were able to draw down funds from the city. Okay. The reality is that that is just totally unacceptable, and there has to be a way of addressing it. So we've heard some solutions tonight. I'm not that familiar with the with city government's But the reality is that the city should not be able to enter into contracts and to begin services unless the contract is registered, unless the budget is input into the system, unless the advances have been paid. It is absolutely unfair to the organizations that are doing this work to be operating in an environment where we have to depend on either private resources, our own resources, or the city. This is something that the other is transparency. You know, it would be really, really important for the city to be able to identify very clearly how it's doing as it relates to its contract registration. So I serve, as I indicated, on the advisory committee to the Mayor's Office of Nonprofit Services. It would be helpful if there was a report that was available to that group and to those of us who are on the advisory committee that identifies whether or not the city agencies are making payment in a timely fashion and whether or not the contracts are being administered. And that's the same thing should be available to the general public through the mayor's manager. But we should know how people are. And then the other issue is in terms of fairness. You know, this is a city that is committed to racial and gender equity. The reality is that the workforce that we employ are grossly underpaid. And a lot of that has to do with the funding levels in the current city contracts. And the city really does, in fact, you know, we're talking about a city, we're talking about affordability. It is unconscionable that individuals who are doing this work on behalf of the city are working on, are living property. We're doing work that is critically important to the city. And we are, as a city, in a position to do something. So this idea of just making sure that if you are providing a contract, providing services to the city, that the amount of funding that is in your contract is enough to make sure that people are being able to be paid. So again, thank you for this opportunity. I'm really hoping, you know, after decades of doing this work, that we'll find real solutions that will solve this problem. Because honestly, organizations like ours cannot continue to survive under the current circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you for your view so much. Vice Chair?
Yes, thank you so much. I feel your collective pain and I appreciate your testimony. I would like to push you a little bit on the impact of passport, because there was a lot of promise surrounding what would happen. And I would like to understand from your collective perspective, why didn't the things that were promised happened? So what are what's the impact of passport? And if you had to choose sort of one thing that you would make sure it got fixed tomorrow, if you were given passport, what's the one thing that you would each do?
So I would say the providers should answer that last part, because they're the ones who have to live with passport on a daily basis. We don't have a contract with the city. So I will say, I think passport, when I think back to before HHS Accelerator, obviously do not want to go back to that system. I think passport exacerbated the transition into passport is really what exacerbated the problems, not the system itself, in the fact that it came, HHS Accelerator was decommissioned, everyone had to move over into passport, and it happened during probably the worst time of the year and when there was already a backlog of contract actions. So passport itself is not the problem. I'm not saying it shouldn't be improved. We should, you know, it's better than where we were. I don't think it's as good as an HHS Accelerator, but it's also a much bigger system. So I would say, I think it's just the transition exacerbated issues. And now that there's such a big backlog, that providers can, you know, do multiple actions at once. And so there's only so much that a technical system can, you know, take on at one time. And so when providers are waiting on indirect from FY21, which is indirect cost rates, and then they're waiting on 3 amendments and they still have a contract registration pending. So I think that's really the issue with passport. And at the end of the day, passport has to be moved forward by people in chairs hitting buttons. And so that's where, you know, a system still is only as good as the management behind it and who's in charge of, you know, we've seen with Accelerator and other systems, someone will still email someone outside of the passport system and say, oh, will you, you know, email me that document over here. And so if you have something like the Mayor's Office of Contract Services having authority over invoicing and payment, they can plug that more streamlined into passport, and there's an accountability of, you know, you have to do what we say. And so, and I would say, I can answer that last part, is making sure that providers can submit all their contracting actions and not waiting until things are approved would be one of the many things that I think could improve passport.
Yeah, in terms of an improvement to passport, that's what I would echo as well. It forces nonprofits to make really unfair choices. The fact that you can do one thing at a time in the system forces you to make really unfair choices. Do you pursue the additional advance, or do you wait and hope that your budget will be approved so you can submit the invoice? Or just for an example. And I do think that my experience with passport transition has been that I think it just created a lot of confusion, and you know, folks knew how to do it in Accelerator, and then when that transition happened, it added the uncertainty to the backlog that already existed. And as issues came up, I think a lot of the agencies weren't clear on how to get those issues resolved.
Yeah, I would agree. No, I think that part of the challenge is the fact that, as you rolled out the system, the agency staff weren't that familiar with it, and we're trying to figure it out as we were. The fact that you can only do one thing at a time, and if there's an activity going on, it stops all your payment. And the lack of transparency, you know, it'd be great to be able to go into the system and see exactly where the item is, so you know what phone call to make in order to get it moving forward. So that lack of visibility into the system also is somewhat of a challenge. Sometimes that's due to the fact that people aren't using it on the agency end the way it's designed to be used.
I have a couple of quick questions. Based on something that you said, Michelle, but we'd love to hear from all of you. You talked about one is giving Mox more authority over payment invoicing. And I'm curious whether you have specific authority that you would recommend, or are you making a general recommendation about giving them more discretionary authority? And similarly, when you talk about timeframes, so that we could give the procurement board more authority to establish timeframes. And again, are there particular timeframe that you would recommend embedding in the charter, or are you more asking for giving the board more authority to establish timeframes under something spread?
Yeah, I think I'll tackle that second one first. The kind of longer answer is, I mean, I wish we could just say 30 days like the controller, but realistically, there's, you know, DOI, like the agencies don't just have the same, you know, process as the controller who gets a complete package. So I think it shouldn't just be giving more authority to the PPB to establish timeframes. It should be directing them to establish timeframes. And that can be done in partnership with the city data that's already been collected. And so, you know, for me, I think it should be 2 to 3 months from the moment the award is announced, given what we've seen. But I would definitely, you know, if I'm not the expert, I have not worked with the Mayor's Office of Contract Services, I have not executed a contract, but, you know, a lot of the issues at the city can be done concurrently, like DOI can be looking at something while a budget is being generated. So it's not like the controller's office where they have to wait and then do things. So they don't need as much time, you know, every part of the process doesn't need their own clock. And so I think the PPB should be charged with actually establishing those timeframes. And, you know, from the moment the award is announced, so a nonprofit finds out that they get the award to registration, what those timeframes should be. But I don't think it should be like, I don't have a hard 30 days, 60 days. I think at the end, it should be, and I also have this in my testimony, that the city should not, as to Fred's point of how he's kind of working with the city now, but we should say that a city agency should not ask any provider to start services on a contract until it's registered. And that would be kind of what's at the end of the clock, because what we find is a contract is late. If you announce, and we see this all the time, most recently at the Department for the Aging, we saw contracts that were coming out, the awards were coming out a month before that. You found out you won the contract, like a month before the service needed to start. There's no way you're getting a contract registered in place. And so that would help, you know, having established timeframes and saying, you know, from the moment of award to contract registration, this is what needs to happen, and this is the timeframe, would really help. So that's my first answer. And then I've already forgotten the second, your first question.
It's a similar question about Mox, about giving Mox.
Yeah, so we would be happy to work. There's OMB has very similar language already in the charter that we think you could lift and move, but we'd be happy to work, you know, on more specifics. But we do think it should be Mox has more authority in the charter, and IBO, second IBO's testimony, and you can actually really lift simple language from how OMB is structured to say that they have authority over all invoicing and payment when it comes to standardization and process. So pretty simple language that already exists in the charter, just as it relates to OMB. Ron.
Okay. Thanks for the beginning. I'll do.
Okay, oh, there we go. Thank you, sorry. Thanks for the work you all do. I'm curious if in the time you all have been doing this, have there been any periods where you have seen conditions improve or timeliness improve or timely payments actually happen? And if so, what were some of the kind of elements to those moments of bliss or when it was going right? Right.
I don't think it was quite this. But, I think that when there's real focus and real commitment on the part of the administration, when there's real collaboration between the nonprofit sector and leadership within the agency, then things can begin to move. There were periods of time where there was more transparency so that we were able to sit down, take a look at where issues were, and really sort of focus our energies on trying to get some resolution. And when that was happening, we saw the needle begin to that organizations, different agencies sort of understood how they were performing against the city's expectations, that information was available to the nonprofit sector, and there was a real focus. That's what we're doing.
Add really quickly that this administration, Mayor Adams actually cleared a backlog of $6 billion that he inherited within the first 6 months, 6-ish months of his administration. And so we know that it can be done. Like that's a huge amount of volume of contracts to be able to register. So I would just note we have that moment. I would also say to the question, there are city agencies who do this better. The Administration of Children's Services certainly has a better track record even now across administrations and now of registering things. So I would point to that. I think as another, just there are some bright spots.
I just had a couple of questions as well. Oh, sorry.
I was just say from a policy standpoint, I think also what has really helped, additional advances are extraordinarily helpful. I'll remember it safely.
So thank you again for your testimony. My question was around, just going back to Mark's potential elevated authority. And I think, Lauren, you said that because you have contracts with several agencies, you're experiencing firsthand that invoicing is not handled across all agencies the same. Is there a specific recommendation that you can give based on your experience on what that would look like? And then I have one more question for all of you.
I think the review comes down to two high-level categories. One is the format and one is the substance. I think if there could be a standard format and then a substantive approach that you're never going to be able to prescribe every single step, but has at minimum or should take no longer than, that would be enormously helpful. Because what you deal with quite often is that not only does each agency want something in a different format, they also ask very different levels and types of questions at different stages of the process, which means that sometimes to get to a particular step, it almost feels like you're going through an audit on the front end in order just to get the initial or the initial. So I think that.
Thank you. And my other question on accountability, do you have any data on the amount of interest on a given year that your members have paid for, just so that we can understand just economic impact of some of the propositions we have?
Yeah, so unfortunately, so the answer is yes and no. Sea Change Capital Partners has really great data that we're happy to send to you all after this. I think it might be a little retroactive, but we can certainly share that information. And I think from our moment in time survey that I had mentioned, we found that, and this was a moment in time. So it was just from about 60 providers that they were owed $350 million at that one moment on their contract. They had credit, a line of credit or loans for $87 million, not through the loan fund. So, just that's different. We love that. And $6 million in interest payments. So if you want to extrapolate, 87 million equals $6 million in interest payments. But Sea Change has some stronger data about what that looks like. And I think in two ways. The first is groups who are able to take lines of credit and what that costs. And second, what's just the other money that's spent when contracts are registered late. And I know I'm preaching to people who know this better than me. When you have to chase down your dollars on a daily basis, what aren't you doing? When your management, when your CFO is looking through contracts to send to me, to send to Mox to say this is late, when you're worried about paying vendors and moving money around, there's actually a cost there, right? Of like, what should people be doing instead? And Sea Change did a great report on kind of extrapolating what that would look like. So we'll send that to you after.
Thank you. There's two last questions before we play this.
And I'm just gonna follow up on the accountability issue, because while there's some suggestions that legislation should be passed to require the city to pay interest on outstanding contracts, and that's one way of going at it. The city's good for the money in the end anyway, right? Paying interest to your members isn't really gonna help solve your immediate problem where you're providing service from day one, not getting paid for months. That's not gonna help you with your cash flow problem. So what other types of accountability do you think, beyond Mox becoming a chartered agency and maybe having more authority, more oversight? Is there something else that you think that we can recommend as the Charter Revision Commission to actually speed up the process? So that you're not waiting and then collecting interest, because at the end of the day, you're still behind.
So we also in our recommendations do have that we should be prohibiting contracting agencies from asking a vendor to perform services before a contract is registered. There is a unspoken partnership that Fred is not closing a shelter while he waits for his renewal contract. And the city relies on that and exploits that. And so I don't know that there's much else in the charter. There's lots of things through public shaming and requiring, better management reports. Bloomberg had great management reports that actually were a great mechanism for us to see who was doing well and who wasn't. And so we do have in our longer set of recommendations, making sure that there is a reporting of that information. So I would add that to this. But I do think it's, timeframes, it's having Mox, because it is, and even the idea that like the city's good for the money, that's not true. Our providers lost a lot of their workforce enhancement funds because the agencies didn't allocate it until June and told them you had till July 1 to spend it. So a lot of them lost that money. So they're actually not good for the cash.
So just not to, Valerie's question, not to slow this down, but it's interesting, you mentioned the issue of the workforce and workforce development. Is there any way that you could provide to us, not tonight, but at some point in the future, the impact of the slowdown of payments and your ability to recruit, retain people in this sector, whereas over the past 30 some odd years, the government has transferred most of the responsibility of social services to the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, I would love to share and talk more about that.
One last question to ask.
I'm not gonna belabor, because it really was one request of money that you have to pay out in order to managing your budget in a way that you have to guess, right? How long it's gonna be for your budget. Because you're paying on license, you're paying on interest. Mr. Jack mentioned late fees and penalties. There is a cost to a delay of money. Of course, there's a human services cost, but there's a financial cost as well. I think Ms. Jackson said that you had a report that you would share with us, because I think that goes into this accountability section. How do you get for that money? And Ms. Similar, say correctly, the legal aid on a national level is one of the agencies that's being looked at in terms of potential federal rights. So I would imagine this conversation right here is very critical.
It's certainly critical for lots of reasons. We absolutely appreciate the time tonight. And I did just want to echo one of the points that you're making about the timeliness, not just of receiving the funding, but of having the amounts confirmed. So when, just to add a finer point to that, when the amounts are confirmed 6-9 months into the fiscal year, there's no way we can plan to spend that money. So there's no way that we will actually be able to spend that money by the end of the fiscal year, which then means that potentially just goes back to the city. So whatever the commitment was in terms of the value of the contract, less is actually spent due to the confirmation of the amounts.
But can you use the excess money to pay for the money that you want?
Yeah.
You right?
Yeah.
And so you still have to have money to pay for the money that you may or may not get when you don't know you're gonna get.
Exactly.
So that that was the question, and understanding your thoughts on how to solve that, and you answered a lot of that.
I want to thank you so much for your testimony. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's gonna be a quick request. We really represent very large nonprofits. In fact, not really representing the overwhelming majority of nonprofits that are receiving city money. New York's one of the few places that actually has
for many of them, their first grant is coming from government. That's a pretty scary thought too, because that risk of that. It's not represented in the sea change report, but if you can provide or add to the testimony, the differential impacts for smaller organizations versus larger organizations. It doesn't mean that, you know, that what you're saying is not important. I just think that the smaller nonprofit impacts are not necessarily represented in the testimony.
Yeah, and very quickly, just to say that HSC represents about 85% of the contracted city dollars for competitive. But that's not discretionary, and that is a huge issue. So I totally echo that, and we will send you the numbers pale in comparison to the competitive contract numbers, but discretionary is a huge, if you're a small organization, and also share some of the organizations who are really connected that we work in partnership with. So absolutely, thank you for raising that.
Thank you all so much for the work that you do for the. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to invite a city councilor, city council person, Julie Wong. Welcome, Councilman.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to my neighborhood. So my name is Julie Won. I'm currently the council member representing Long Island City, where we're sitting, as well as Sunnyside, Woodside, and Astoria. But I come before you, this really astounding commission, for two reasons. I'm coming here as a council member to speak about land use, as well as the chair of contracts, for all the reasons that you've heard. Since I've taken office in 2022, it's clear to me that none of our nonprofits are getting paid. And all the stories are the same. They are struggling to make ends meet. We have seen, especially the Black and brown, smaller nonprofits suffer the most, where we're at the risk of closing them down completely because they've not been paid in the last 3 years. And they are doing extremely important work. Their workers have been furloughed, yet they are still doing crisis response for cure violence in a high-risk area like Queensbridge houses, to do gun response when there's a shooting with no guns, with no life vests, no bulletproof vests, but they always show up, whether it's 4 a.m. or 6 a.m. and our city relies on them, but they are not getting paid. If this wasn't any other sector outside of the government, you would have gone into collections and you would not be here anymore. The amount of debt that we would be in, it is unbelievable. For all of our human services workers that are doing the work for our communities, they deserve to get paid, and the mayor's office of contracts should be a chartered agency like OMB. It has to be, because what I'm seeing firsthand the last 3 years as a chair of contracts is that we have a slew of issues. We are under-resourced for the technology itself. Passport is outdated already. The user experience is crummy. For me, as a chair of contracts, when I'm seeing reports of corruption or a need for accountability, it takes 72 hours for me to get a compliance report from Microsoft DOS. How are we going to keep anybody accountable if our software itself is so incredibly outdated? And because of the complexity of the processes of the agencies, we can't have an out-of-the-box system where you can just purchase the software and think, well, this works for other companies, so let's just open it here. No, we're going to have to personalize it, we're going to have to customize it, and it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of work, but we have not put in the resources to invest in the sole system that we are relying on to digitize what has once been a paper-based as well as a siloed, individualized system. We have to come to a place where we have standardized the processes itself across all agencies, even with agencies like DOE and H&H, that we have not been able to get contracts for because they don't go through the city's. They aren't a city agency and they don't go through the same contracting process. Yet we've invested millions of dollars in these emergency city contracts, for example, for the migrant crisis. But we don't have the purview over them as we would for other city agency contracts. In addition to the technology itself, we also are doing a disservice by investing what we have in the millions for Passport, yet we have paid ourselves quality assurance, the same person to do quality assurance. Can you imagine if you as an employer, you tell me, Julie Won, why don't you evaluate the quality of your work about yourself? That is never how it works in technology. I spent 10 years before this working for a very large tech company as a federal contractor. Some of the practices that we are doing is a disgrace and it's a disservice to the public, and it is no surprise that as much as Passport is trying its best, that we are far, far behind what we should be in 2025. In addition to the technology itself, We are finally working on something that's called document vault. So one of the woes that some of the contractors have is that you have to upload the same document multiple times for every single agency if you're doing business. And we still haven't standardized simple things like insurance premiums for you to do business with the city. If you are a nonprofit that services CHF, as well as DIFTA, as well as DCLA, then you better have all of your insurance premiums. That's going to cost you an arm and a leg so that you can provide a service to the city, because we haven't figured out how to speak to each other on standardizing our processes, our systems to make it easier for them. But now we finally have a centralized place where you upload your document once, but now we're also looking at how we create a system with our state partners so that you're not uploading it more than a few times with the city and the state. In addition to that, we just don't have enough bodies and resources. The pegs that Mox has seen has been horrendous. We are fighting for barely about 10 people every single year baseline. And the mayor's office of nonprofits was abysmal. The last 2 years that I've been in office, there was one person and maybe 1.5. And now we're trying to get more people in the job, but we need to actually have support for these nonprofits to be able to do business with the city. And the user experience itself is extremely hard to understand. If you put Gen Z in front of it, they would cry because it is so non-intuitive. You would look at it and be like, what is this artifact? It's not okay. But in addition to that, for our nonprofits, if you are a nonprofit that services a certain cultural language-based community, good luck, because you're only doing it in English. And procurement language in itself, unless you come from a procurement background and you understand supply chain, you are now looking up these acronyms and trying to figure out in your home language. Let me see what this is in Chinese. Oh, no translation exists in Google. So you have already created barriers for the people that need to service the most vulnerable communities to be able to access them. So we need to invest in the system of contracting itself, and we need to keep ourselves accountable by allowing ourselves to have interest payments of what is owed, because these people are taking out loans. And I've had conversations with local museum in my districts, local nonprofits, schools like this, LaGuardia, which is right next door. Those people are taking out loans with high interest rates themselves, begging for you to pay them back in at least 5 years' time. Okay, putting that aside, and I'm happy to talk more from a technology perspective, from a process perspective, from the PPP perspective, for procurement law rules perspective, but for land use. Where we're sitting right now, Long Island City has seen 40% growth, more than the city itself. We have grown 6 times the rate of how fast New York City is growing in terms of density. That is all good and great. And during the first 2 years of that I've been in office, I have never been against density, and I have always accepted more and more populations. We opened the highest amount of shelters in the whole entire city for migrants, so we have 38 shelters collectively. That amounted to more than 18,000 people being homeless in this district once the 30-60-day rule has been passed, where that policy was rolled out. That means mostly West African migrants who are sleeping in tents, who are sleeping in my parks, who are sleeping in our community gardens because they have nowhere to go. We need to build housing. But what we've seen from City of Yes, and what we've seen from even the shelter conversation, some of our neighbors cannot accept the fact that they have to do their fair share of opening a shelter. This needs to be a charter revision where we say that no matter who you are, no matter how wealthy you are, no matter how white you are, you need to do your fair share and open up shelters, equal distribution throughout the whole entire city in 51 council districts. No buts or if. And just because you cry and scream and you go on national TV, crying bloody murder, asking for mass deportations, it does not matter. Everyone needs to have borough-based jails, shelters, supportive housing. We need to make sure that we have equal distribution for the health of our city. In addition to that, what we're seeing is that people don't want to see shadows in their neighborhood. And I understand change is scary, but we are in a housing crisis nationally as well as in the city, and we have to walk a fine line of not taking away powers from the council, because if you look at a project like Innovation Queens, I was only able to negotiate to have 45% affordable housing on a private land with a very high value market because we were able to leverage the powers of the city council to negotiate that. That was historical. So we need to make sure that there is some sort of fine line where we say, hey, you have to do your fair share. Every single council district has to meet a threshold of X%, and maybe we do it by ratio of population growth or a forecast of population growth that we want to meet to make sure that we are holding them accountable, but we still have to allow them to negotiate because no one knows their community better than the council members. Where I know from the back of my hand what percentage of growth I'm expecting for my 3K classes, pre-K classes, what my birth rate was for my local hospitals, and what schools I'm going to need for which areas of my neighborhoods, and where I'm gonna need a new park, where I'm going to need a new library, and what my people are asking for. So these negotiations can only happen in a way that the community won't be up in arms, in the way that people did not want to accept City of Yes as a blanket conversation, but working with the council to make sure that we are meeting a minimum threshold of saying we have to build because we have a housing crisis, but here's how we're gonna get there. And I am a huge proponent of comprehensive planning, so that means neighborhood rezonings are essential to get our social infrastructure in, our public infrastructure in, as well as getting private developers to develop in a quick period of time. So I look forward to working with you. And one last thing I want to ask is for publicly owned land, for example, underneath the Queensboro Bridge, there is massive amounts of parking space, just parking and storage. Some are just empty underneath the BQE ramps, just empty. Yet we have no park space, we have no green space. And the agencies have this ability to say, no, I need this for parking, or I need this for storage. It should not be that way. The charter should mandate that the mayor or the council have the ability to solely decide how public land is used, especially if it's gonna be for public good, like green space, or selling the FAR to build more density. Because I have been dealing for more than a year now with DOT, asking them to write an RFP because I have so many developers who want to develop and take the, buy the FAR. We would be purchasing it with millions of dollars, and DOT saying, no, 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 no. I'm not giving up any land for anything, even if it's not for development, just to sell your FAR. They're refusing. That should not be okay in a time like now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're gonna open up for questions, and I would ask the commissioners to remember to speak into the microphone. I think people on Zoom are having a hard time hearing. So I'm gonna start with Commissioner, we'll work down this one. Chance.
Good to see you and thank you for your testimony. So I wanted to ask you, I'm not clear on this, but about fair share. I was told that there's a way that this is determined and throughout the city. And if I'm hearing it correct, the way it's determined is not a good way. And if you can give some clarity on how fair share is determined and what we can do as a charter to kind of center it in a better way.
I think if you look at the maps now, because New York Post has done a great favor to the whole entire city by publishing where all the migrant shelters are that are run by DHS as well as the parks. The top 3 shelter locations are my district, not where the wealthy people live, but next to Queensbridge houses, Ravenswood houses, and Woodside houses, where the poorest, smallest population of Black people live in my district. That is not okay. But that's what they've done, because the next up is Councilmember Feliz, a very low income Latino and Black district. Next up, Rafael Salamanca, again, another very poor Black and Latino district. Next up, Speaker Adams, Selvina Brooks Powers, Natasha Williams, again, low income Black and brown districts. This has been done historically amongst multiple mayors and generations of New York City history, because it has been easier for them politically to get away with putting shelters in poor Black and brown districts than putting them in wealthy white districts, where they will cry bloody murder and say that you can't have these shelters here.
What is the mechanism that the city used to determine this is what fair share is?
They didn't do fair share. They only did it as an emergency response, saying, we're gonna create hotel shelters, and the fastest way we're gonna get hotel shelters are finding hotels that are boutique, that are not name brand, who can't survive during COVID, and we will make them into shelters temporarily. And both parties get to benefit because they get a profit and we get a shelter out of it temporarily. But DHS has said clearly over and over again that hotel shelters are not what they want. nor is it sustainable for the residents or the agencies themselves or the city, and that is not preferred. So I recommend that if we have 51 council districts, that we have equal distribution, and it's gonna differ by population. So if we have, for example, at one point, we had more than 50,000 people in a shelter. 50,000 people divided by 51 districts, and we have to figure out a way how to get them evenly distributed as much as possible in all 51 districts, and not 51 districts and only the black and brown poor parts of people's districts, but in all parts of everyone's district.
One last thing, I'm sorry. So if I'm correct, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, when they site in a shelter in a district, they're going according to a population count of a need?
No.
No? What is that? How do they determine that?
They just have a list from the hotel, I forget what the actual list name is, but I have the list. Where they know the vacancies of hotels, and hotels are willing to go into a city contract because they're saying, I would make more money as a shelter than I would waiting for clients to come, because my hotel is overridden in a terrible place in the middle of an IBZ and nobody really comes here anyway, and I actually only opened it to become a shelter primarily. So that's what it's for, which actually reminds me, right now, the city is going through a study of all of the IBZs, and not all IBZs are the same. If you look at an IBZ like mine's in my district in Long Island City, Dutch Kills, those IBZs are empty. They are barren, they're vandalized, and they have no business going on. There's no manufacturing. We have to allow them to build housing, but the current mayoral policy does not. And we have had multiple meetings now where the landowners as well as residents have said, we don't want to walk there, we don't want to be there, we don't want to do business there, because all there is violence and dirt there, but we would love the opportunity to build housing there. But we're being denied. So we really implore you to consider that in an area like mine, where there is high density and people clamoring, we have less than 0.4% vacancy rate. That's how popular this neighborhood is to live here. Yet we are not allowing them to build housing so that we can try to accommodate everybody.
Next, come this way.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilwoman. I actually grew up in this neighborhood and I remember when. I grew up in
Welcome
Astoria.
back. We missed you out of that.
There were only two tall buildings when I left Astoria in Long Island City. One was the Citibank building and the other one was City Lights. Everything else was no more than 5 stories. They were all low rise. There was really nothing here. And so what we've seen, as you pointed out, is expanded growth in Long Island City, probably the highest density. And I think you said 40% of the development in New York City has occurred in this area.
Let me get the exact stat, because I
You
don't
know,
wanna,
while you're looking.
yeah.
But you mentioned a couple things and I'm hoping you can help us with this. So one of the things you said is everyone needs to participate in the development of housing across the city. If all 51 council districts agreed to build 5,000 units of housing, we could solve the housing crisis in this city. But what gets in the way far too often in either rezonings or the approval of development projects is member deference. How do we get around that so that, because I think it's important, when you're elected to represent a community, you know that community intimately. You understand what makes it tick, what the people want, but sometimes the people say no. So how do we get around the issue of member deference so that we can actually get to the point where we solve the crisis?
Yeah, so let me get the quote right. It's the stat right, as Long Island City's population grew by 40% within the last decade, which is which is almost 6 times faster than the growth rate for New York City at large. And how you get around member deference. It's not a matter of getting around member deference. It's making sure, one, that you have a speaker that is aligned, that understands that housing is essential, which we currently do. It was clear to me when I was going through Innovation Queens, there was a very fine line where the speaker said, how do we get to a yes? You're not gonna vote no, but you also need to understand how to leverage your member deference to get to as much affordable housing and community benefits as possible, which is how we got the 45%. So we have to leverage the power of the speaker, and we also have to make sure that the members individually also understand. I had very little support where if I said, I'm gonna vote against this project, I'm gonna vote this down, that my colleagues would say, yeah, sure, go ahead. You do that. It was not a possibility anymore. I know that there was an example with Harlem that happened way early on, but I think that was something that the speaker as well as the council noticed as something that should not be a practice or a precedent. And we troubleshooted that and corrected that right away. I understand your concerns because I saw it firsthand at City of Yes as well, but I don't think that anyone in the city is going to be okay with getting rid of the ULURP process as is. I do understand, and I am grateful that the community board is advisory, because if I only had that, if it was binding, then I would never be able to pass any project even here. So it is a lot of stakeholder management and it is community building, but without all of these pieces, we would not get the best for our community as we would. Because even right now, going through the One LIC project for the neighborhood rezoning, if my neighborhood wasn't as organized as they are, I know that we wouldn't be focused on what our community needs are, knowing to the dollar amount, what the estimates are, and working together with the council as well as the mayor's office and everybody involved to get to our end goal.
If I one thing, and if you can't answer it tonight, that's fine, but maybe if you some thought into it, if there was one thing we could do to reform the ULURP process, to make it work better so that we could actually accomplish the goals of developing housing,
Well,
what would it be?
We have to shift to a neighborhood rezoning. We are the only major city of our size that is not doing comprehensive planning. It is a disservice to ourselves because what we're seeing, especially in Long Island City, is we've allowed these individual ULURPs to go through and they're fine because we have all these sky rises. But guess what? That developer is only responsible for his block of upgrading the sewage. Everyone around him, nope, he's not gonna upgrade that. So what do we have? Even in the fanciest parts of Long Island City, you have brown backwater. And you have sewage issues. You're getting poop in your toilet of somebody else's feces when there's heavy rainfall, because we go from 16-inch pipes to 3-inch pipes within 1 block radius because it has not been updated. And we can't live like this anymore. And we can't depend on one individual developer to create a new school or to create a new park. But if we collectively work together, then we have a collective investment as well as estimated tax revenue where we can say there is enough for us to warrant having a population growth to open up a new school, to have a new library, to have a new YMCA. Sharon is here from the Y. We want to see collective investment both from the city as well as the developers. And when you do it in a comprehensive way, we have a better chance also of having MOUs and labor agreements and getting the best bang for our buck for the ways that we use our land. We have to do comprehensive planning and neighborhood rezonings. The current administration has been a strong champion of that in a way that we haven't seen to this size citywide in every single borough. But this is the way we should be moving. We can't do piecemeal, especially because Department of City Planning has no staff. We don't have the time to be processing 5,000 ULURPs a year.
Council member, thanks for your testimony and truly thanks for being a housing champion. As you noted, I was taking a look at the New York Housing Conference scorecards. You are amongst the top 10 in your district or citywide of council districts that produce housing. And I just wanted to ask a little bit more on this concept of fair share. You noted it for shelters, for supportive housing. Does your thinking on that extend to all kinds of housing? And you also noted that it requires a strong speaker and a strong council member, especially in a world of member deference, to push housing forward. And the speakers introduced the fair housing framework, which I think gives us that framework and this idea that we should start naming what it looks like for different council districts to be producing their fair share of housing. So I'm curious how you would put teeth on a framework like that and how that squares with the existence of member deference. Because as you noted, you've been successful in negotiating projects because you are supportive of housing, the speaker is supportive of housing, but we also have examples across the city right now of projects that have stalled because the local member doesn't support that housing project. I can think of a few off the top of my head, and one project that comes to mind that isn't even in ULURP, doesn't have a clock, project like Just Home. There's no local support. It's been stalled for a very long time. I started in my current role over a year ago and it's just been sitting. It's an important supportive housing project that's had no ability to move. So how do we square this idea of fair share with the existence of member deference where you don't have supportive council member?
Yeah, it's clear to me that with our financial realities, we're not going to be able to build 100% affordable housing everywhere. And in a district like mine, where you have opportunity to build R8, R9, R10, where you can get 60% affordable, 60% market and 40% affordable, vice versa, that it is worthwhile because of the units that you'll produce. So I think there's two facets of very important things that we're not doing as a city. One is education. When I sit down with my community and explain to them for the first time what a neighborhood rezoning is and how it differs from a ULURP, how you, instead of 60 days community feedback, you're going to have more than a year, where I'm gonna give you 13 town halls, focus area meetings, two surveys, 2 mailers, 3 canvassing rounds. Then they start to realize like, oh, okay, so this is not how it works. But there's a huge gap of understanding, because when you go to these communities that vote against projects or say I'm against this housing coming here, if you ask them what a ULURP is, they're gonna be like, what is that? They don't know what a ULURP is, and they don't understand what their role is, they don't understand what their powers are, so we have a huge education gap that we need to do in a lot of these communities that are against it. Then secondly, look, it's clear, elections have consequences. And people need to be civically engaged, understand who they're voting for. Your community has to be engaged, organized, because guess what? If the people who are pro-housing are not organizing, the other side is, and has been. That's abundantly clear. But I guarantee you, every corner of the city, there are pockets and large groups of people who want to see housing built, but they have not been mobilized, they have not been educated. And we have to do the outreach to make sure we're getting there, which is why I've upfronted more than $50,000 to do education and outreach to my communities to build up support and at least get their understanding of, because my ULURP has failed 4 times.
That's fair. I mean, I do think you're pointing out exactly what the problem is, that people will vote in who they believe will stop housing. And that tends to be more powerful in our city. So I guess I'm
But
curious,
the other
on the fair housing framework, what are some of the ways that we could actually have that, you know, because as you noted, the speaker's been a champion of housing. Are there ways we can actually have more teeth to produce housing in districts unlike yours that have not been doing their fair share?
I mean, I think that's why we're here for this discussion, right, with the charter, to see if there are ways that we can revise the charter to have fair share revisions to say that there is no but sortives. Every 51 council district will have to build housing, and it'll be different because the amount of housing I can build is not how much housing like Southeast Queens, actually Southeast Queens is doing a great job. The middle of Queens, Eastern Queens will be building with their single homes. So I think there are nuances, but it can be done.
I'm just gonna follow up and ask, because I think all of us are struggling with respect to member deference. And you use the word minimum threshold, right? That every CM has to say, I'm committing to this threshold. What's the accountability besides elections? What's another mechanism that we can ensure that distribution and that those minimum thresholds are met? And you can think about it, but I think that's part of the struggle here, is with respect to member deference, how do we ensure that that complete fair share is actually enacted?
Yeah, I think it's something that I still have to noodle with and think about, but just know that member deference is not gonna be something you can outlaw, because it's based on relationships. You know, I've had colleagues where they were depending on member deference, it didn't work out for them. Because not everyone respects each member. But it's based on your relationship and their trust of you and understanding of your district and the ways that you have been communicating it with each other. That is what makes member deference work in negotiation. So it's not something that you could just like squash out and be like, well, the charter says member deference is not available anymore. We're still gonna be sitting there conferencing, be like, look, I will get to a yes, but I need your help, and this is how we're gonna get there. Or someone might be like, no, I'm gonna be a no forever, and I hope you'll be there with me. And depending on how their relationships are, that can carry. So it's something that's very sensitive, but it's also very powerful, but we all have to work together to really understand the bottom line, which is you all need to do your fair share. We're in a housing crisis, and for each district, it will look different because I can carry a lot more density than somebody else can. But what does that mean? Is it by percentage? If your population is 185,000 people and you're looking to grow your population by X percentage to meet our housing goals, then this is how we're gonna get there in stages or phases.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, council member. We really appreciate your testimony here, leadership, Sarah.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Feel free to reach out to me anytime. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Next we'll be joined by expert panel, Andrew Ryan of the City Budget Commission and Rachel Faust of Reinvent Albany.
And speaking of deference, it's been deferred to me to go first.
Good evening, members of the staff of the Charter Commission. My name is Rachel Foss, and I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for reInvent Albany. We advocate for transparent and accountable government in New York. We urge you, members of this commission, to set your sights high. Show New Yorkers you are truly independent and ready to propose the major ethics reforms needed to restore public trust after the massive damage caused by the scandals that have rocked city government to the core. Citizens Union reports that 2 times as many senior city officials have resigned due to corruption during the Adams administration as did under the 4 previous mayors. Corruption at City Hall is the issue of the day, and this commission has to rise to this moment or risk losing a generation of New Yorkers to cynicism about government and apathy about their right to vote. Unfortunately, it's obvious that the federal sheriff is ridden out of town and New York is on our own. We have to strengthen the city's frontline ethics and anti-corruption agencies. We urge this commission to do the following 3 things. 1, create a New York City Independent Ethics Commission. 2, make ethics guidance far more transparent. And 3, study and propose a removal mechanism for the mayor. First, in creating a New York City Independent Ethics Commission, this is our main recommendation today, that you propose a ballot initiative creating this independent commission that puts the functions of the Conflicts of Interest Board and Lobbying Bureau under one roof, that is funded via independent budgeting and governed by an independently appointed board. New York's watchdog groups and independent ethics scholars strongly support the basic responsibilities of the state's Commission on Ethics and Lobbying Government, COLIG, which includes ethics and lobbying regulation under a single commission. Ethics laws are meant to prevent corruption, hold public officials accountable for misconduct, and protect against the appearance of misconduct. When the people believe their government is corrupt, they lose confidence in the ability of government to solve their everyday problems, become cynical about democracy, and apathetic about voting. In working with our watchdog colleagues, we have helped to advance improvements to the State Commission and recently submitted an amicus brief and successfully upheld the constitutionality of this commission before the State Court of Appeals. That body has a number of features that should be replicated at this New York City level to improve independence. First, lobbying ethics under one roof. There's not only logic to this arrangement, given the intersecting moonlighting, post-employment, and gift laws, it also ensures regulators have access to information necessary to conduct enforcement actions. 2, independent budgeting. The current Conflicts of Interest Board is down 5 staff from 10 years ago, and its budget has essentially remained flat despite huge increases in inflation and an expanded mission, including regulation of legal defense funds. We strongly support providing the Conflicts of Interest Board and any future ethics commissions an independent budget. Now note that the IBO, who just spoke to you, has an independent budget. COIB has proposed past charter revisions that would peg its budget to the total net expense budget of the city. I think depending on how much responsibility this agency has, you might want to adjust accordingly to make sure it has the proper resources. 3rd, independent balanced appointments. The State Commission has 3 ways that its appointment process increases independence. First, there's a screening panel for nominations. The state's law school deans approve nominations sent by the appointing authorities to ensure candidates are qualified and will serve with integrity. Second, there are balanced appointments. The governor does not have a majority of appointments, but rather appoints 3 of the 11 members. The current Conflicts of Interest Board has a majority of mayoral appointments. The mayor appoints 3, and then there's 1 each from the comptroller and public advocate. Lastly, the selection of the chair is by the commission, not the appointing authority. This is a crucial mechanism to ensure the body operates with consensus and independence. Lastly, independent investigators. COLIG is not reliant on the Inspector General of the state. While at the Conflicts of Interest Board, they are dependent on the Department of Investigations, which is appointed by the mayor. We also recommend that ethics guidance be far more transparent. There's a couple ways to do this. One is that confidentiality can be waived if an official provides misleading, inaccurate, or incomplete public disclosure of ethics guidance. The State Commission recently adopted an advisory opinion to this effect. And second, written opinions, when their existence is disclosed by an elected official, could be proactively made public at that point. Lastly, we urge you to study and propose a removal mechanism for the mayor. We know you have an upcoming Charter Commission meeting on government reform on April 9th. This could be a place to discuss this in greater detail. We also encourage you to review Citizens Union's report on charter reforms, which includes discussion of this issue. You also have my full written testimony. I didn't quite get to everything. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to present our recommendations. I'm Andrew Ryan, President of the Citizens Budget Commission. I also want to thank all of you for your service on this commission and frankly, knowing your lifetimes of service to New Yorkers. Tonight, I present 3 charter changes that would improve how city government serves current and future New Yorkers. Our companion report provides more details and draft charter language. First, the charter should require a resident feedback survey that represents all New Yorkers. The city should conduct and publish a statistically valid resident feedback survey at least every 5 years, with results valid at the community board level and disaggregated by key demographic groups. The mayor's management report includes many indicators about what the city produces. While the MMR's indicators should be improved by including more efficiency, quality, and outcome metrics, the MMR lacks an entire category of critical data, and that is customer feedback. To serve New Yorkers well and improve city agency management, the city needs feedback straight from New Yorkers. We are the customers of city government. Everyone deserves a voice, and this survey would ensure that that voice is not dependent on having power or money. The last commission considered this proposal, and we encourage you to move it to the vote. Second, the charter should require the city to create rainy day fund deposit, withdrawal, and balance rules. The 2019 Charter Revision Commission wisely helped the city create a true rainy day fund. To ensure this fund best serves New Yorkers, the charter should require the city to deposit money into the rainy day fund when the economy is growing, and only use that money as intended to protect New Yorkers from dramatic cuts during a recession or short-term emergency. We and others have extensively analyzed how best to structure the fund. The charter should set the framework and then require the specifics for formula-driven deposits and proper use of the fund be detailed in local law. Embedding this requirement in the charter will ensure New Yorkers' future is better protected, rather than being exposed to greater than reasonable risks that often result from shorter-term political desires. Third, the charter should be changed to improve the accuracy of financial plan estimates, and I will note that this year is the 50th anniversary of New York City's fiscal crisis, and what better time to improve the integrity of the budget than this year. The charter already requires revenue and expenditure estimates to be, quote, reasonable and appropriate. Sadly, this is not currently the case. The charter requirement needs to be bolstered. The city has increasingly under-budgeted for planned expenses, reaching unprecedented levels. This distorts the city's fiscal picture and the accuracy of the financial plan that is the very foundation of budget decisions. Just this year, for example, after budget adoption, the city had to add $3.6 billion to support current year spending, not for unanticipated costs, but for expenses that we all knew would be needed when the budget was adopted. It just wasn't there. Furthermore, the fiscal year 2026 preliminary budget is $4 billion short of what is needed to provide many of the planned services, though it may still over budget for migrant services. Just think about this example in an area that you guys are all concerned about in terms of housing. The city will spend $1.1 billion this year on city PEPS housing vouchers, yet is only budgeting $519 million next year. That's less than half we're spending this year. That's not a, quote, reasonable and appropriate budget. I mean, I would call it something else that begins with P. To ground the city budget process in accurate revenue and expense estimates, the charter should require detailed explanation of the causes and significant changes in 2 circumstances. 1, when tax revenues or major expenditures are projected to change up or down more than 10%, just provide an explanation. And the other time would be when executive expense estimates vary more than 20% from either those by the city controller or those by the state controller. Just provide the sunshine to straight bolster the requirement that currently exists. I'm happy to answer any questions now or later. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here tonight.
Thank you both very much. Any questions from the panel?
Mr. Ryan. Related to the budget and your role as a watchdog of the city's budget, we heard testimony at our last hearing from a Cornell professor who attributed one of the reasons for the decline in housing production to the fact that in the 1975 charter, the City Planning Commission was written out as a co-author of the and planner of the 10-year capital budget. We've also heard testimony from last hearing and a little from today that comprehensive planning has to include not just planning for housing, but for the infrastructure related to housing. Would you recommend or support the reintroduction of city planning as an equal partner to OMB in the creation of the 10-year capital plan in order to have a comprehensive infrastructure plan?
I will say we're gonna come back and testify more on our land use decisions as we're refining those recommendations, and we will have more to say about comprehensive planning. So I want to defer to that, not to avoid, but come back with more full, thoughtful answer. But I will say this about comprehensive plan. If we have a comprehensive plan and shared goals, and we've talked a little, and that council member said about that, then we could then design our land use decisions to favor actions that are aligned with those, to speed those up. That would be helpful. In terms of combining the infrastructure with the housing and putting city planning on equal footing, I will come back to you.
Thank you. Commissioner Savino?
Thank you. So you said that you'll be back for a subsequent charter revision commission meeting where you're going to discuss more about ethics and recommendations for good government.
I think that, the April 9th hearing,
Okay.
I know that you have another government reform session.
So we'll get into some of the recommendations that you had in greater detail then, but I want to focus on one that you mentioned, and that you think that we should take up an issue of removal of the mayor. Not that I support that idea, but that we should do it. But right now, under state law, it grants the governor the right to remove an executive, whether it be municipal one, county, or any duly elected executive pursuant to the service of charges and the ability to be heard, either in the area where whoever the governor is would determine. It could be in state Supreme Court, it could be in the legislature, it could be in her office. What do you think needs to change about that?
We think it should be a locally controlled process. I think ideally you would have something that would be different than the inability provision, which doesn't really foresee some of the circumstances we've seen. So I think it would be better for the city to propose and create a process for itself. We don't have a formal process that we recommend at this time. We think it would be a much better process to have the city determine how to do that itself.
So as you're familiar, the charter talks about, it enshrines the state law in there, and then subsequently talks about the inability committee, which is really related to the inability of a mayor to serve because of physical, mental, or they're not here. Are you suggesting we add a different category to that?
Well, I think, at the state level, there's an impeachment process. At the federal level, there's an impeachment process. There are a lot of legal scholars on this topic. I think that it could be an interesting topic to have some people come in and figure out how a New York City focused process could be.
But then wouldn't that executive, whoever it happens to be, this one, the future one, wouldn't they be subject to two different sets of standards, one by the state? Because we would have to change the state law as well, I would imagine, if we're going to create a different standard for removal in the city that was not related to physical inability and or physical inabilities, whether or not the mayor is disabled and can no longer serve. Because that's what the charter talks about. So if you're suggesting a different standard to be of due process for
Not
ethical
necessarily a
transgressions.
different standard. I mean, I think the 30-day process in state law sets up a defense mechanism for the mayor, for example. I think that could potentially be mirrored at the city level. I just think it would be worthwhile for city voters to have a view into that process, rather than have it be something controlled at the state level.
One would argue that city voters already do have a view into this process. It's called election day. You don't like what you have, you get rid of them, then you get somebody else. But I mean, I'd be really interested between now and the next hearing on good government for you to flesh out that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Nieves?
Hi, my question is for Mr. Ryan. And thinking about the Citizens Budget Commission, you sat here earlier through some testimony, particularly about what are some of the further transparency recommendations in the budgeting process. I was curious if you had any that you want to add to that. The closest you came to that was talking a bit more about the deposit withdrawal guidelines on the rainy day fund, but if there were any others, I'd love to hear that.
And if I could just first reiterate, that is part of what we're talking about in terms of the integrity of the executive's budget estimates. And as I said, right now, I don't believe that the budget actually conforms to the charter. Because I don't think they're accurate and reasonable estimates that are in the budget as we speak, which is unfortunate. Of course, we have 4 borough-based jails, but there's no charter kind of violation jail, you know, in the capital program. So the answer is to then provide that sunshine. So if the budget from year to year is going up or down on revenue or expense by more than 10%, that should be explained. And again, I'll just reiterate the example on City Fest housing funds. No one here, including myself, believes that the city's planning to kick half the people off their vouchers on July 1st or all of them off on January 1st next year. We all believe that those vouchers are going to be honored for the year, but the budget doesn't have the money. It's that kind of transparency to be if spending is going up or down more than 10%, or if spending estimates, revenue estimates vary from the city or state controller by more than 20%, there should be an explanation there. That kind of sunshine would help bring integrity to the budget process that doesn't have now. And I will just mention, I've been watching this off and on for 30 years. It's never been like this.
Yeah, I just want, it's not even a question so much as a statement, and I want to thank you, Andrew, how you related some of the budgeting problems to how it impacts housing directly. I think that's helpful for me, speak for myself, obviously, the testimony also relates. Obviously, we're talking about good governance and it's broader than housing, but how the proposals you all are putting forth relate to housing, I find that very helpful, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you both so much for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. We have one final expert panel before we go to public testimony. That will be Susan Lerner of Common Cause and Ben Weinberg of Citizens.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Ben Weinberg. I'm the policy director at Citizens Union. First, I want to thank the commission and the commissioners for holding this hearing. I know you are a housing focused commission, so we are grateful of you holding a government reform, not one hearing, but 2. Today, we published a report that lays out a series of recommendations and reforms we believe are needed to strengthen our democracy, our ethics laws, and our checks and balances in city government. In my remarks today, I'll just focus on a few key proposals, but our report includes more than that, so I welcome any questions and comments on any proposal there. So first on democracy and elections. The slide, which I asked to put up the screen there, and thank you very much, illustrates an alarming trend we have with voter turnout in city election. It's dropping, it's declining for decades. If you see the orange line, it basically drops with every cycle. The orange line there is the mayoral turnout. In the last mayoral election, less than 1 in 4 registered voters cast a ballot. That was a historic low. Now, we've done a lot to make voting easier in New York, but we haven't really been able to move the needle on voter turnout. So we have to reverse the trend, and we have 2 recommendations for that. One is moving our city elections to even years. So our odd year election calendar really suppresses voter turnout up and down the ballot. And that's clear from every study, campaign, or experience of other cities. Turnout for mayor is not only very low, it's also our electorate is older, is wider, and is wealthier than the city of a whole. Now, the impact of moving the election year would be significant. And if you click the next slide, you'll see how other cities that have change their election year, how that impacted turnout over there. Now, the state legislature already moved many local elections to even years, and there is an ongoing campaign to amend the state constitution, which currently requires, unfortunately, that our city elections will be on odd year. So our ask from the commission is first to support that effort to increase our voter turnout, and secondly, to consider how the charter might need to be changed should the constitution change. The second point is about opening our primary system. So, our closed partisan primary system currently excludes over 1 million unaffiliated voters from being able to participate in our elections or in our primary, and that number keeps going up. So if you can click to the next slide, you'll see the number of unaffiliated voters is on the rise. We know from studies that these voters want to participate, they want to be part of our primary system. Our proposal is to be hold what's called the top 2 primary system that's used in California and Washington and other jurisdictions. But there are other ways to go about it. The other reform I'll mention here was I mentioned earlier about checks and balances, and that is a glaring omission in our charter, which is which became apparent lately, and that is that we don't have a clear process for removing a mayor for exceptional circumstances related to its conduct. And removal does rest only, the power rests with the governor, who wields absolute authority. We do feel strongly that the charter should establish a removal mechanism that would be practical, fair, and balanced. That's easier said than done. And we detail in our report several challenges. Impeachment was mentioned earlier, but impeachment is usually a 2-step process. We have 2 chambers, but in New York City, we have only 1 legislative chamber. There's also recall elections, but recall elections has a mixed history, I would say. And there are also risks of partisanships, obviously. We are working on a more detailed proposal and look forward to presenting it to this commission in the future. And I will just comment to Commissioner Savino that we are very supportive of changing state law to limit the power of the governor as well. Finally, a note on ethics. Our report lists several ways to strengthen our anti-corruption regulatory regime. One way is to strengthen the conflicts of interest board. The CYB has a very critical role, but faced budget stagnation and staff cuts. There's a tension with the CYB budget. The people who fund that agency are the people who are regulated by that agency. Other agencies in that same situation have received protected or independent budget, like the Campaign Finance Board, or the Public Advocate, or the CCRB in another context. So we do recommend providing the CYB with independent budgets and significantly increased budgets. And if that is provided to increase their powers to several other areas, which we detail in the report, including lobbying oversight. Again, I want to thank you for your work and your commitment and your public service, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you. And I do not have written remarks at the moment, but I want to really divide what I have to say into sort of 3 different categories having to do with public participation. First is the entire question of how we run. And I would recommend that there should be increased study for any possible changes to how we increase our elections, but that we really have successfully adopted ranked choice voting, and that we should have the benefit of 2 entire mayoral election cycles with ranked choice voting, a thorough analysis. I believe it has been successfully adopted, a thorough analysis of how voters have handled ranked choice voting, what has and has not worked with the extensive education program around ranked choice voting before we really dive into yet another way to change how we vote for our New York City elections. But we are supportive of a discussion of when we vote, which I think does have, as been pointed out, a significant impact on turnout. And that we believe should engender 2 separate ideas. We join Citizens Union in our support for consolidating municipal elections to even years. But we also would recommend that we change the provisions having to do with special elections. Not as far as city council district elections are concerned, but as far as citywide elections are concerned. And it's our recommendation that there should be no citywide special election which takes place any closer than 60 days before a state or city primary or general election. And that is one, because it's very confusing to the voters, but also because of the cost and the tremendous administrative challenge of running two citywide elections back to back. Talked with people at the Board of Elections. We were talking back of the envelope estimate, $15 to $20 million for a special election. And we know special elections are the least high turnout of any elections because they are confusing to voters. So we suggest that there be a revision to the charter, which now talks about the date of the vacancy rather than the date of the actual special election, to be sure that we actually are not confusing the voters, not wasting money, and not creating an administrative nightmare. And I'd like to talk about a way, two ways in which to provide the voters with more responsibility for what's happening in our city. The first is that I think we should be talking about a recall. Now, I lived through the California recall when I lived in Los Angeles, where you had 115 people who were running to replace Gray Davis, and it was kind of a nightmare. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of people showed up, they voted, and the people were the ones who decided whether the executive should stay in office or not. So while we're struggling with who should be able to recall it, should it be the state, should it be the city, there is an obvious answer, which it should be the voters. And that should be a recall if there is a significant problem with a citywide elected, then the voters should have the ability to petition and put a recall on the ballot. The other, I do not want this suggestion to be misinterpreted. I have great regard for this panel, but it is the third panel in a year to look at the charter. And there is a radically different way to approach charter revisions. And that is to have impaneled what is called a citizen assembly. And I will provide some written background on citizen assemblies, but it is a way of convening a longer term, in essence, study group made up of a large number of citizens who are chosen by lot, but also to reflect the demographic and ethnic and economic background of the city. They are provided with expert background and they hold a facilitated discussion. We would recommend that there be an automatic citizen assembly every 20 years. I would suggest that it be held on a year that ends in 7, that it be impaneled with the resources to be able to consider the entire charter for 12 to 18 months with the idea that any recommendations would be put on the ballot in the year that ends in 8 for the general election, and that there be a prohibition on any proposed revisions to the charter for 5 years after the citizens' suggested revisions have been before the voter. So it was a radically different way to approach it, but one that actually educates residents and has much more direct democracy to it. So thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Obviously, we both of them, I'm so happy to see both of you, Ken. And I'm sure we'll have more discussion in April on some of the ideas you have around forming the removal process for an executive in the city. But I want to hit on 2 issues that both of you talked about. The issue of moving elections to the even years. It's been attempted in other parts of the state. I think it was ruled to be unconstitutional because it requires an act of the legislature and then a constitutional amendment. But the concern that was raised in those localities was that in a city where people are already concerned about one party rule, and I happen to belong to that party, but not everybody does. And as we're seeing from the enrollment numbers, more and more people are disenrolling the Democratic Party for a bunch of reasons, which we don't go into tonight. But if you move it to even year elections, those of us who have worked on elections, we know that you have a higher turnout of Democrats in New York City. So the argument would be, if more and more people are walking away from a party, but we're now rigging the system so that it favors Democrats, how do you argue against that? What's your argument against doing just that?
First I'll mention on that court case has been ruled unconstitutional by lower courts, but
Right.
it's before the Court of Appeals and it has yet to be heard by the Court of Appeals. I would say I respond two ways. First, the political context around New York State is different than the political context in New York City. I'm not sure that increasing or doubling or tripling voter turnout in New York City would have a huge impact on the identity of the winning party. There's been interesting studies on the political impact or partisan impact of this shift because it has been done in actually it's been done in over 100 jurisdictions, but in big cities. To summarize, the truth is that there hasn't been a big change in terms of who eventually wins those even year elections after we move them to even years. The other thing I would say is that another argument is that low turnout elections actually are the ones that allow, quote unquote, special interests to gain more power, right? So if we vote for our mayor, our council, everyone in city government by 60% turnout, we just respect the will of the voters.
So
more votes.
following up on that, one of the other issues that came up at the previous charter revision hearing, we didn't take it up last time, but it is an issue that has kind of risen to the top in a lot of localities, the issue of either open primaries and or nonpartisan elections. I've never quite understood what an open primary is. Why not just move to nonpartisan elections, eliminate the primary process, if we're worried about saving the Board of Elections money, we just move to the general election where everybody could run. And why not do that? Why one over the other?
Well, I'll say first, we debated internally whether most cities around the country have completely nonpartisan elections. You're not allowed to put party affiliation on the ballot. We do feel that putting that party affiliation on the ballot does give some indication to voters of who that candidate is. We also think parties should be able to endorse or support specific candidates. So that is why we specifically did not support a full nonpartisan election. Now, to the question of whether a primary or not a primary, it's true that many jurisdictions with ranked choice voting, for example, have only one election. Could be general, could be some other time in the year, but one election. But there are other systems out there. Seattle, Washington are about to do a similar top to ranked choice voting. So in that situation, ranked choice voting would just be the primary of ranked choice voting would just kind of minimize the field for two candidates until they will run in the general election. So I don't know if there's a correct answer, to be honest.
I don't think any of us do, but I definitely want to hear what you have to say, Susan, but I do have one more question and I don't want to hold everybody up because we have 30 other people that want to talk to us tonight. On the issue of recall, are you not at all concerned that in an era post Citizens United where extraordinarily wealthy people can influence the election, that someone could be behind a recall for any elected official, mayor, senator, governor, it doesn't matter who it is, and because we have seen that happen in other states. Are you not at all concerned about something like that happening?
So I think it's always a concern. That's why my organization is a strong proponent for correcting the mistake that is the Citizens United decision. But there are also issues regarding the removal process that has been problematic and that does not reflect necessarily the will of the people. So again, I would favor more direct democracy rather than less. And I do want to say, in terms of the open primary, we are not necessarily endorsing the top two. We're still looking at it. There are various ways to do this. And our study of unaffiliated voters surprised me with the number of unaffiliated voters who actually said, I don't want to be part of a political party, but I understand why there are party primaries, because if you are part of a party, you should be able to control what your party does, and that gives the party people an opportunity. So there are forms of open primaries which do allow unaffiliated voters to participate that we talked about in the last Charter Revision Commission. Again, I think this is absolutely an important discussion, and it's one that I think should continue over time.
Any further questions for the panel? One thing I would ask, as you consider these is, more information about the experience of recall elections in other places. I think the flip side of that kind of direct, recall, a lot of challenging, potentially chaotic political experiences in other places. And so trying to understand what the risks are, as opposed to, as we said, allowing the voters to recall every 4 years in their elections. Appreciate hearing more about the experience of other places.
And it's, the question is, what is the appropriate level to get a recall? It's not something that you want to be able to just snap your fingers and get recalled. And I do want to say that we do endorse Reinvent Albany's call for a ethics commission. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. All right, so our first panel, so for the panelists, the first panel is Eric Coburn, Jennifer Geiling, and Bernard McBride. As you come, please keep your testimony no more than 3 minutes each. I'm going to ask the commissioners, given the late hour, to try to keep the panel's questions to no more than 2 per group, if we can. So I would encourage everyone to be thoughtful this time.
Good evening. The Bump campaign would like to thank Charter Revision Commission Chair Fury and commission members. I kindly acknowledge my nonprofit colleagues on the commission. My name is Jennifer Geiling, and I've served in the human services, government, procurement, and contracting sectors for more than 25 years, including serving with the Mayor's Office of Contract Services and establishing the Mayor's Nonprofit Resiliency Committee. I am here representing a campaign to bring up minimum pay for human services. We are proposing a charter amendment that requires contracted human services to be funded at a true cost of living. In 2022, voters passed a charter amendment to establish and annually report on a citywide true cost of living measurement. The ballot explained that the measure focuses on dignity. Dignity is foundational to our proposal. 15% of New York City private sector employees, approximately 600,000 people, work in a human services related industry. It's a workforce funded and directed by city contracts, which the charter calls client services. While this workforce supports people living in poverty, nearly 90% of these workers are earning poverty-inducing wages. A single adult New York City human services worker earns an annual wage of approximately $40,000. This is significantly below the cost of living in New York City, with nearly 30% of this workforce receiving SNAP benefits. Based on Urban Institute's True Cost of Economic Security measure and findings for New York City, a salary of $40,000 means that a single person household is under-resourced by as much as $63,000. Many words can describe this economic reality. Undignified is at the top of the list. The charter's preamble sets collective values to guide the city's activities and uphold the rights of residents, including the rights to have resources to prosper economically and build wealth. The current level of contract funding is not only inadequate to pay a true cost of living, but impossible to realize prosperity and wealth. Those impacted by this underfunding are identified in the charter as historically marginalized. The workforce identifies as 80% people of color, 87% female, and 63% foreign born. It is for these individuals that the charter demands we act intentionally. The time to act is now. With the introduction of a true cost of living measure, the city now has a standard on which to base human services wages to uphold the right to economic prosperity, dignify the work of 600,000 people, and stop ongoing inequitable systemic harms. In Charter Section
Yeah,
16,
Sorry, to interrupt, we're at 3 minutes.
I'm in my last paragraph, sorry, I'm speaking slower than I did at home. In Charter Section 16, the mayor must report on social indicators and equity, including budgetary resources allocated to reduce poverty. The city's current under-resourcing is poverty-inducing, not poverty-reducing. We respectfully submit that the charter should require client services to be funded at a true cost of living and such funding to be reported annually. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Eric Kober, and I retired in 2017 as Director of Housing, Economic, and Infrastructure Planning for the Department of City Planning. And I'm currently a senior fellow at the Institute. I'm speaking tonight as a private citizen. So I want to address, as a land use veteran, issues of land use reform, and I'm going to specifically speak to 2 issues. One is reducing the time and cost of going through the land use process. And the second is addressing the issue that came up tonight, which is member deference. The primary time and cost issue with the land use process is environmental review, which this commission really can't deal with in state legislation, but there are some useful changes that this commission can recommend. One that I would recommend is to combine the time for the community board, the borough board, and the borough president into a single 60-day process. The current, or the 1989 charter assumes that the borough president and the borough board need to get the community board's recommendations in the mail. That's not really true. They talk all the time, and you know, you can really shorten the process. Other things this commission could do would be to look at some of the items that go through your, like dispositions pursuant to zoning and minor changes in street grade, and just take them out of the process and create an administrative mechanism instead. On the member deference issue, charter change creates an opportunity to accomplish the referendum, what we could probably never accomplish through any other means. One possibility is to create a Department of City Planning, a zoning administrative position. The administrator would be charged with review and approval of minor waivers and zoning rules. Building on the testimony at the last hearing of my former colleague, Bishan Chakrabarty, I recommend that the charter change, if this were to take place, specify that one such change would be the approval of residential buildings on any lot zoned for residential use up to 6 units and up to a height of 35 feet. This is an inherently affordable form of housing, which requires no public subsidy, and it would be similar to what some state legislatures have mandated. For example, in Washington State and in Arizona, most recently, but which are not going to get done in the New York State legislature realistically. Thank you, and I'll answer any questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. My name is Bernard O'Brien, and I reside in Brooklyn. I'm going to piggyback a little bit off the gentleman from the Citizens Union, but I'll try to summarize. Several years ago, your predecessors gave New York City voters the option of revising the city charter for the purpose of ushering in ranked choice voting. Voters overwhelmingly said yes. I respectfully request that the commission allow voters this coming November to take another step forward by ending the partisan and closed nature of our city's primary elections. Having a unified, nonpartisan, and open primary for each elected city office, which is the norm in a great many other cities, would yield a number of benefits. First, our closed system excludes participation by the roughly 1 million registered voters and taxpayers who wish to exercise their legitimate right not to align themselves with any particular political party. Open and nonpartisan primaries could also help remedy the fact that our existing system generally leads to November matchups, which tend to be almost ridiculously non-competitive, with many voters given little incentive to show up at the polls or closely scrutinize candidate positions. For example, each of the past 3 mayoral elections were decided by margins of over 35 points. Looking at the non-mayoral elections in 2021 reveals additional evidence. The winning candidates in the public advocate and control races each won by mega landslides of roughly 45 points. The 5 borough president races were similarly lopsided, with margins of victory ranging from a 20-point Republican victory on Staten Island to a more than 65-point victory in the Bronx. Of the 51 council races in 2021, only 3 were decided by less than 10 points. Over half were decided by more than 50 percentage points. And in several others, there was no opponent in the general election. Is this really what robust democracy looks like? Returning to the 2021 mayoral election, I'd like to very briefly speculate on what might have been different had we had open and partisan primaries at the time. I'm not here to second guess the ultimate outcome of the race, but instead to point out that our existing system yielded a November election which was far less competitive than it could have been. You may recall that after the ranked choice votes were tallied in the primary, Eric Adams prevailed over Catherine Garcia by a mere 7,000 votes, less than 1% of the votes cast. Meanwhile, Curtis Sliwa, depending on the much smaller number of Republican voters, easily captured the Republican nomination. It's noteworthy that Mr. Sliwa was able to secure a spot in the general election despite the fact that there were 4 Democratic candidates other than Mr. Adams, who on primary day had received more first place votes than did Mr. Sliwa. 3 of those 4 received more than at least 3 times as many votes as did Mr. Sliwa. So in contrast, imagine if all the mayoral candidates in June 21 had run in a unified primary open to all voters. The purpose of this primary would have been to determine the top candidates who would have moved on to a much more competitive race. I'll note that registered Republicans could have still been empowered to rank Mr. Sliwa first on the primary day and rank others, presumably conservative candidates as well. In closing, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia once quipped that in delivering municipal services, there's no Republican or Democratic way to pick up the garbage. So why do we think that that partisan political primaries, which exclude 1 million of our fellow New Yorkers, are the best way to select candidates best suited to compete in well-contested general elections? Having nonpartisan primaries would arguably serve us much better. Please allow voters this coming November to render their verdict on this much-needed reform. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions for the panelists? Needed?
Thank you all for your testimony. I have a question for you, Eric. You mentioned one item that you talked about collapsing the time of the CB Borough Board and the Borough President. But I'm fairly confident that you have many additional ideas that you might be able to share with us. You know, you talked about environmental review being the thing that takes a long time. I've heard ideas about ways in which we could exempt certain types of projects that might be, you know, below a threshold that might make some sense. But in addition, I wonder if you have any thoughts about the beginning of the process, which, you know, is really a place where things can drag on for years before anything gets into Wheeler. And while if you have anything to say right now that would be helpful, I would love it if you could share some suggestions with us about things that we could think about in that regard.
Sure. One of the suggestions that I've heard, which I'm kind of uncomfortable with, the idea of having a clock for the pre-Euler period. And my concern is that if we had a clock for the pre-Euler period, a new period would emerge, which is the pre-Euler period, in which all of the inefficiencies would be sort of pushed earlier, and so you're sort of chasing your own tail, and so this is in part a staffing issue. This is in part an issue of actually try to reduce the complexity of zoning so that people don't have to go into ULURP. But it's sort of very hard to do it through, you know, as far as I can tell, through the charter.
Thank you so much. Well, Commissioner Weiss running first.
Yeah, in addition to what Anita Lermont asked for, Eric, when you submit further thoughts, could you give us your thoughts about comprehensive planning and the question that I asked Mr. Ryan earlier about providing city planning with a stronger role in the capital budget process or an equal role in the capital budget process as a means of addressing the issue of infrastructure fairly throughout the city.
Yeah, I have to think about that, but I'll communicate with staff.
Thank you.
Thank you. And last question for Commissioner Barrett.
I was referring to your the 60-day process, and I'm definitely all for streamlining the ULURP. The question I have for you is that enough time, and how would that work to still involve community input? Beyond just the board and stuff like that within that process, how does that work?
Well, the community board now in New York has 60 days, so for the community board, it would be same. Question is whether the borough board needs to meet later and the borough president needs to consider the application only upon receiving the communication from the community board. And it seems to me that in the age of electronic communication, everybody knows what everybody else is thinking, and that's not really necessary. And you can shave 30 days off the process by combining everybody in a single 60-day period.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
The next panel will be Alicia Boyd, Richard Ronner, and Kimberly Cruz. Alicia Boyd, Richard Ronner, and Kimberly Cruz. And while they're coming up, I'm going to alert the next panel so that they are ready to come up quickly. That would be Joshua Kahas, please forgive me, from pronunciation, Cormac Slade Bird, and Shane Moynihan, and you will be next. Thank you. Please.
I can start.
Yeah.
My name is Alicia Boyd. I'm a political activist. I was in front of you in Brooklyn. And there was a question that one of the commissioners had asked, and I was reflective about it, so I wanted to kind of address it. And the issue was, well, how is it that we stop development from occurring in communities that become very desirable? I think it was you that asked that question. And what we are seeing or what we've experienced is that it's speculation and money that drives that conversation. It's not that all of a sudden somebody decides that they want to live in my neighborhood. It's that the prospect of development in my neighborhood is what then drives it. For example, a rezoning was being planned for my community. All of a sudden, all the land started being brought up. Within 1 year, we had spots all over the community being brought up because the anticipation that a rezoning was going to happen. Now, we've already tried the city planning position of doing community planning. That was done under the Bloomberg administration. There were 15 community boards that were supposed to be doing these community planning. And we did community planning in those districts. But the final result was that the community's suggestions were never incorporated into the final rezoning plan. It was really driven by the real estate industry, which was the invisible elephant in the room at every step of the way. We got no infrastructure support at all, even though the law required it to happen, and we did file a lawsuit, and we were supported in the lower court for that. So communities all over New York City said, well, we're not going to engage in community planning because we realized that, and no one's speaking about this issue, is that there's a huge financial interest in communities of color because the land is cheap. You buy the land, you're speculating, you develop it, you got luxury housing, and now the developers make money. How do you deter that? Well, you don't speculate, you don't rezone those neighborhoods, right? You don't incentivize developers to go into a neighborhood and rezone it by not rezoning it. Of course, nobody wants to hear that, right? We already want to hear development, 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 even though we've seen that development actually does not produce housing that's affordable to the residents. And in particular, in communities of color, it just displaces the existing population, and thus we have this huge displacement issue. I don't see anyone talking about that issue. And so I think that they should. And just one more thing, the EULA process, when it begins, an application has a 99.9% chance of passing. So it's not the EULA process, because once an application is certified, they have a tremendous amount of there's only been 2 applications that have been rejected within the last 10 years by the Department of City Planning. And one was in my community because of the shadows on the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens. And we filed a lawsuit for it. But that's it. So everything else gets passed. So while we're focusing on shortening, you know, that little month so that the community doesn't really have anything to say, or you don't really have to listen to the community, that's not where the power is. The power is before the application is certified.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Richard Bronner. I live in Astoria. This is about open primaries. Every day we hear dire reports that our democracy is under threat, and I believe it is. At the same time, many problems and crises we're all concerned about also seem increasingly dire and existential. Climate change, pandemics, war, exploding inequality, homelessness, just to name a few. And I'm a believer in democracy. I believe if we're going to have any hope of progressing on these issues in ways that take into account the interests of all of us, we're going to need more democracy. Here in New York City, we have a closed primary system that excludes, I came up with 1.2 million voters, those not registered in either major party, from voting in the often decisive first round. That's about 23% of the city's voters. And if you consider an election like this year's mayoral race, and it's pretty certain the winner of the Democratic primary will be our next mayor, you could even count among those excluded 500,000 Republicans. Now, it's 34% of city's voters excluded from weighing in on a very critical race and very critical races in elections that we all pay for with our tax dollars. That's not right. And this could all be remedied with open, nonpartisan. Now, you could ask, why does a responsible citizen choose to register independent? It's a good question. More people should ask. I choose to register independent because I don't feel represented by either major party. And I don't like to misrepresent myself. I've been registered independent for about 45 of my 75 years. But I still want to be able to vote in important elections. With roughly half the national electorate now registered independent, and it's even higher percentage amongst younger and newer voters. This is definitely something we need to address. So I thank the Commission for the opportunity to speak, and I urge you to consider democracy, fairness, and inclusion, and put this question on the ballot for open, nonpartisan primaries that would let all voters vote at every stage of the process. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kimberly Cruz, and I'm from Flushing, Queens, New York.
So historically, and I'm so grateful to be in an intergenerational conversation, we can see the line of history just sitting here. So if anyone can really take a picture in 2025 of what it means to have identity and representation, and what Thomas Jefferson wrote, which the city council removes his statue. And it shows the unity is not the factor that's leading our representation. If they're removing the person who wrote our Declaration of Independence, that is our fight, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So when we're talking about these things, we put education in the center. So I came here grateful for the leaders that have come before me, the civic leaders, the ones that are here sitting after how many experts who've had a lot of face time with our government all the time, have money after Citizens United all the time. And I am 26 years old. I just turned 26 on George Washington's birthday yesterday, on Saturday. And I'm just here, I can't believe we're removing these books. I can't believe Adam Winkler, professor and law professor, talking about corporate rights and what Citizens United did in a very layman's term way is not in everyone's bookshelf. I don't know why the premonition of Michael Lewis is not there when he's talking about the evaluation of the Trump administration and everyone else who knew about pandemics. I went to Yale University. I went to Bronx Science. I am grateful for Flushing, Queens. I am grateful for the library, but I am seeing us deteriorate the things that made our New York City spirit strong. This charter is valuable. This charter comes from 1624, the Dutch who came here and touched on the indigenous people who were protecting this land for thousands of years. We don't know Pangea, when it started, when it ended, but history is important. Our human species is important. And we are all the same species, and we have animals of all the other different species that we're trying to protect, and we can't communicate about education. It is baffling. Old thought leaders that do not know that progress is in front of them. Old thought leaders that in Staten Island, they're showing that the House Speaker states do not let one voter be miscounted. Every vote counts. And last year in 2024, New York Congressional 6th District of New York, the 6th Congressional District of New York, that the HUD reports as the most diverse district of this whole nation, of the United States of America. That's called NY6. If you don't know it, search it up. It is my home. But it is not okay that it was diluted. And New York knows about it, but they do not tell the people of New York. Our New York City spirit is dying. The Big Apple that never forgot 9/11. I grew up with that. I saw New Hope when I was 9 years old, but we are forgetting, and you're allowing the federal government to defund 9/11 victims. You are forgetting that the 7 train line that connects all international communities that speak 800 spoken languages and dialects from the north of Queens to the south of Queens to the east of Queens and the west. And I know my time is up, but we do not have the time to silence us. I walked miles and I've never seen any of our leaders talk about the things that I've spoken about. And I know this is too much, but hindsight is 2020. We are the tree and key to democracy. And I am baffled. I know I'm an American patriot. I'm a purple patriot. I don't know what else we're gonna change. I know, but it is,
Thank you so.
thank you, purple patriot. Thank you.
Any questions for the panel? Thank you so much for your testimony. Next up are Joshua Tejas, Cormac Slade Berg, and Shane Moynihan. And just to alert, the next panel will be Alex Papas, Edward Brady, and Harsha Hanumeya. One thing I want to ask for people in the audience are ASL, we have ASL translators, they're scheduled to be here till 8 p.m. Will anybody here who need ASL interpretation? Because otherwise we'll let them go at 8. They're willing to stay later if we need them, but if anyone need interpretation after 8 o'clock? No, thank you so much. Please continue.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Joshua Cajas. I'm a lifelong New Yorker and a recent graduate of the Government and Politics program, master's program at St. John's University. I come here before you this evening to voice my support for open primaries here in New York City. Though I've been both a registered Republican and Democrat over the years, I'm not strictly a partisan individual, as I have found issues, platforms, and candidates on both sides that I believe in, contribute to, and inevitably vote for. This interest in politics is why I went to school and learned about our government, to more fully understand the issues and what we as citizens can do to fix them and make the government better positioned to work for us. It is why I was compelled to come here this evening to support the addition of a ballot proposal for open primaries here in New York City, and argue that our current closed primary system negatively impacts more than 1 million voters across our city, including me, who do not find ourselves wholly aligned with either party, and takes away our right to voice our opinions without registering as a Democrat or Republican. As a democracy, our government should fully support and bolster its constituents' rights to vote for their elected representatives and create a government more aligned with its people, not just those allowed to vote in a closed primary. A closed primary limits the participation in elections solely to party members and suppresses the voting rights of roughly 24% of New Yorkers who identify as independents. This condensed electorate is further limited by the facts that less than 10% of New Yorkers participate in primary elections, and roughly only 5% of party registrants participate in their party's primary elections. While these primary voters are the most politically active, the Brookings Institute has found that they skew more partisan and polarized than the greater electorate. To make matters worse, primary candidates realize this and configure their platform to be more partisan or ideologically extreme to deter primary challengers. In our current age, it is prudent for us to lower the tension in our political climate and ensure our candidates, electorate, and parties are best positioned to work together towards common ground solutions and not the polarized positions of the few that our current system allows to proliferate. In closing, open primaries can greatly benefit our society by allowing for an ideological variety of more registered voters to participate in the selection of candidates who go on to general elections and ultimately their elected offices. Doing so would make candidates and party platforms more representative of the positions and issues the electorate is supportive of and concerned about. Our government is built upon a strong symbiotic relationship between voters and elected officials, but by using closed primaries, New York City has abused this relationship by artificially constraining those who can have their voices heard. These 5 boroughs are a melting pot of the world. Let us instill open primaries and give us voters a chance to exercise our rights, regardless of party affiliations, lower the political temperature in our society, and select nominees truly representative of their electorate. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Cormac Sladeberg. I'm here today to speak on reforming ULURP, specifically the very first step, certification by the Department of City Planning. There are many good ideas for shortening ULURP that I support, such as combining the community board and borough president review into one step. However, the single longest step is DCP certification, so improving it is crucial. The combined maximum time limit for all steps after DCP certification is 205 days, while certification by DCP is a 100-day limit. Even if they hit that limit, the application then has to file an appeal. City Planning Commission, the appeal could take 60 days before the applicant is given either certification or stated in writing of what further information is necessary. After 8 months, a full month and a half longer than the entire rest of the process, the applicant could get handed a list of further requirements they must submit. For some applicants, this portion of ULURP takes years. In every other step of the procedure, if the relevant authority fails to take action, it can get referred to the next level of review. An applicant could, in theory, reach the city council, if all previous levels fail to act in their time limits. There's no such timer on the DCP certification step. We are in a housing emergency. Year after year, rents keep going up. Year after year, we fail to make any changes. City Council has been declaring a public emergency for decades. Emergencies require action to fix. Certification by DCP need not be an endless time stop. Casting doubt on project timeline, I've written up a proposed amendment to section 197-C of the charter to change the DCP certification process for applications that meet 2 requirements. 1, that we are in a housing public emergency as defined in sections 26-501 through 26-520 of the New York City Administrative Code, and 2, the application increases residential development. For qualifying applications, DCP would have 90 days to either certify or state what further information is necessary. If they fail to do this, within 90 days, the application would be considered certified and automatically proceed to the next section of the review, similar to how subsection J of section 197-C functions for all other ULURP steps. This deadline-driven approach is not without precedent. In California, the Housing Accountability Act's builder's remedy has long allowed developers to bypass local zoning restrictions when a city lacks a certified health certified housing element, forcing local agencies to act in a timely manner. Similarly, New Jersey has seen judicial interpretation that empowers developers to move forward when local governments fail to meet their obligations. These examples demonstrate that when deadlines are enforced, it can prevent protracted delays and boost housing production, exactly the goal we need during a housing emergency. By adopting this 90-day rule, we not only reduce unnecessary administrative delays, but also create a clear and accountable framework that aligns New York City with other jurisdictions that have successfully expedited approvals. Thank you, Chair Barry and the Charter.
Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Shane Moynihan from Jamaica, Queens. Pardon this disjointed, I didn't have any written statements coming in today. I have some things scribbled down here, but you've heard many. I'm here to speak about open primaries, nonpartisan primaries. You've heard a lot of testimony here with statistics of who's being left out, who doesn't have a voice. I don't want to go into all that because you've heard it. I think number one, when we ask a citizen to participate in democracy, which I think is what we all want, right? Whether we're asking them or whether we just want them to do that, we shouldn't ask them to lie. Shouldn't ask them to lie about their identity, about what group that they're aligning with. That's wrong. I've been willing to stay registered Democrat for the last 2 years out of convenience. I used to switch back and forth from independent and Democrat, but nobody should have to make that choice. Nobody should have to have this added inconvenience and an obstacle to participating in their city's democracy and deciding how the city is run. I think the one-party rule that we're obviously not immune to here in New York is adding tension. The betting markets had, as of a month ago, 90% chance that the mayor is going to be the Democratic nominee. What incentive do I have as a Republican, Independent, Green, Libertarian, although some of those have already been kicked out of the state? What incentive do I have to participate, to collaborate with my fellow citizens, with my neighbor, with the Democrat? I don't. I mean, there is incentive, but we're seeing many people don't feel that. February 14th is the deadline where you have to change parties. If you don't do it by February 14th, you have no say in who the mayor is. That's way too late, but there shouldn't be such a restriction in the first place. Running out of time here, I want to say that New York City is a pioneer for this country. We should lead by example. And while I don't think this should be a partisan decision, I do want to speak really quickly about the hesitation some people might have. Oh, this is going to give Republicans more power. Well, I think as New York City, as New Yorkers, we should lead by example and give everybody a voice in our democracy. And may that be the path that we all carry forward, because we're stuck with each other in this country, Democrats, Republicans, whether we like it or not. So let's work together.
Thank you so much. Thank all of you for your testimony. Any questions for the panel? Thank you so much. Blue Red Storm. All right. The next panel is Alex for the Papas, and please forgive me if I name Edward Brady and Tarsha Ubaya. And then the three of you come up. The next panel for in-person testimony will be Scott Kaplan and Alex Hackworth. Hello. Oh, I'm sorry. So Alex for the Papas, Edward Brady, and Harsha Hanumaya. Please come up. The next and final in-person panel will be Scott Kaplan and Alex Hagworth. After that, we'll go to Zoom testimony. Please begin.
Mr. Chairman, fellow commissioners, good
What is your
evening.
name? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Ed Brady. I reside at 30 East 95th Street in Manhattan. Been there since 98. I grew up in the South Bronx. I am independent. I've been independent since 1998. I've gotten my bona fides I've gotten signatures on petitions from Augusta to Phoenix, getting referenda on the ballot to open up the political process and also to put independent people on the ballot. I've heard special interest mentioned a number of times, and I'm going to say this, and it is not being disrespectful. The biggest special interest groups in this country are not named Koch or Soros. It's not the pharmaceuticals or oil and gas. And since we're here in New York City, it's not even Remedy, the Real Estate Board of New York. The two biggest special interest groups in our country are the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. These two entities have encased themselves, they put themselves between the people and the government. And what these two entities care about, their reason for existence, is to garner position and power. And sadly, what they do not care about are the people who voted them into their positions. This doesn't have a damn thing to do with left, right, liberal, conservative. I have worked with people who wear Che Guevara t-shirts and are members of the Christian Coalition. Now, I can sit here and spout things that people from other organizations have stated, initiative and referendum and recall when I was taught back in the late 60s. Term limits, which we do have to some basis here. Ease of ballot access. But to me, the most vital aspect is non-partisan elections. You know, Mr. Chairman, I'm a veteran. I don't say that to be boastful. I'm not looking for kudos. But you mean to tell me that I can take part in the first round of elections simply because I choose not to have a D or an R after my name? D for conservative, G for green, whatever that may be. All citizens vote in all elections. We don't need a longitudinal study about this. We don't need to have dozens of political scientists with PhDs. Straightforward. All citizens vote in all elections. And, you know, Senator, I'm going to take, I'm going to say, you said something, if you want to change something, you know, you go to the ballot box and you change it. Well, with all due respect, ma'am, I can't do that simply because I choose not to have a designation after my name. So how are we going to allow everybody to take part in the process? It's a simple matter. This isn't brain surgery. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Harsha Hanamaya. I just want to say that open primaries would make elections more competitive. Too often races are effectively decided in Democratic primaries, shutting out voices from across the political spectrum. By opening the process, we can ensure that general elections feature candidates who appeal to a broader range of voters, leading to more balanced representation and real solutions to the everyday problems facing New Yorkers.
Any questions for the panel? Thank you for your service, sir, as well. Thank you, sir. Next, and final in-person panel is Scott Catlin and Alex Hackworth.
Hi, just me. My name's Alex Hackworth. I live in Southside Williamsburg. I can appreciate that it's getting late, so I'll keep this a little brief. But I'm the New York City Region Organizing Director for Unite New York. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit focused on advancing structural reform here in New York State. I'm here to urge you to support open primaries. I believe that democracy thrives when more voices are heard and not fewer. Right now, New York's closed primary system excludes over 1 million voters, silencing independents, young people, and working class communities who don't fit neatly into a two-party system structure. In a city where elections are often decided in primaries, shutting out these voices weakens our democracy and leads to leadership insulated by party insiders, not accountable to a broader public. Open primaries would change. They would increase voter participation, foster genuine political competition, and ensure that candidates must appeal to a broad coalition, not just the voice of the most vocal activists. This reform would give power back to the people, ensuring that our leaders represent all New Yorkers, not just the select few who can participate under the current system. The stakes, I believe, are high, as they often are in our city. Every day, New Yorkers face real challenges: affordable housing, public safety, and weakened economic opportunity for our city's most vulnerable. The leaders who make these decisions should be chosen by all of us, and not just the fraction of the selector. Open primaries will produce candidates who must build broad-based support, leading to balanced, pragmatic solutions that work for all New Yorkers. This is not a partisan issue, in my opinion. It's an issue of fairness, representation, and not just the city, but also the democracy that we would like to raise our families. That's why I urge you to put open primaries on the ballot and let the voters decide. New Yorkers deserve a system that will work for all of us, not just the political establishment. So let's open the doors of democracy and give every voter a voice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Any other questions? No, thank you so much. All right, we're going to move to Zoom. The first Zoom panelist is Hope Cohen. Hope will be followed by Jonathan Bloom and then Lori Bliss. But first, Hope Cohen. And again, we'll hear from you.
Okay, I am unmuted. Hi, as you heard, my name is Hope Cohen. Thank you for the time, members of the commission. I'm here to offer some ideas about making the New York City environmental review process, known as SEEKR, more efficient, less expensive, and more useful. In 2007, I published these ideas in Rethinking Environmental Review, a handbook on what can be done, a link to which I can provide upon request. Charter Section 192E assigns to the City Planning Commission responsibility for rulemaking regarding environmental reviews. You, the Charter Revision Commission, may choose to leave all as is, to assign the responsibility to a different entity, or through amendment to the charter, to impose guidance that supersedes CPC's authority. Over the decades, environmental reviews have become big business for lawyers and specialized professionals. All too often, environmental impact statements and even the less detailed environmental assessments range well beyond analysis of impacts on the natural environment, infrastructure, or municipal services. They are protection against litigation rather than true planning documents. We should be using this tool to focus on projects that will require additional infrastructure and/or services. Currently, the requirements for environmental review encompass too many projects and too many topics. As the rules stand, virtually any development that involves government funding or some kind of special approval must go through the SEEKR process. We can filter out many of those as clearly not having any negative impact, that is, by declaring them to be something we'll call type 2 actions. These would include projects that require review only because they include government funding, otherwise they wouldn't need it. And that is a significant problem for affordable housing. Projects where height and/or bulk are redistributed, but actually the density is not increased, and very small residential projects that clearly would not increase demands on infrastructure. It is entirely within the city's power to do this. In fact, just last year, the city took a step in the right direction by creating Green Fast Track for housing. This program defines as type 2 those projects that are of a certain size, use clean energy, and meet standards for siting, hazardous materials, emissions, and noise. The city should also streamline the topics for review. Environmental reviews need not include policy discussions or descriptions of socioeconomic conditions. The review should examine only topics that implicate infrastructure and/or municipal services, including those needed to protect the natural environment. Finally, there is the question of whether required mitigations are actually implemented. From my experience serving on Manhattan Community Board 7, I know that it falls to community boards and local advocates to monitor a developer's compliance with mitigation requirements. Till 2018, that was the case with city sponsored rezonings as well, but now we can use the rezoning commitments tracker to check progress on promised sewage upgrades, park improvements, and advocacy.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're at time. Can you please wrap up?
That's it. Perfect timing. I'm done.
Any questions from Ms. Cohen? All right, thank you. Next is Jonathan Bloom.
Step away.
Okay, we're gonna have to move on to Lori Bliss. No, Lori. Next up is Jenny Dubnow. Apologies if I mispronounced the name. Jenny Dubnow.
Yes, hi. I wonder if you should, just a quick suggestion, I wonder if you should announce the next few Zoom people in a chunk so people can get ready. It might help things, streamline things a little bit more. I know they do that in the city council sometimes. Okay, like many New Yorkers, I'm most concerned about New York City's affordable housing crisis. But it's painfully obvious that the solution to this crisis is not to simply open the floodgates to allow more overwhelmingly unaffordable housing to be built. Two major recent studies show that New York City neighborhoods with major development and upzonings lose affordable regulated apartments at a heavy rate, and Black, Latino, and low-income populations shrink. There's no evidence that building more mostly unaffordable apartments brings rents down at the low end, where most of us are. It is therefore hard to understand the suggestion to bypass and override displacement-based critiques of development projects that can be voiced during ULURP. This override would give developers carte blanche to build even more housing all over our city that most New Yorkers can't afford, actually, by muffling the voices of community boards and community members. The ULURP process is one of the few ways that the voices of community members can be heard. It's not as though developers are being denied. As Alicia Boyd mentioned, most ULURP applications are approved, even in the face of widespread community opposition. So these proposed changes feel like a solution in search of a problem. It's crucial to keep the community boards and local council members' voices alive in this already pro-developer process. And if we're talking about mandating housing approvals by neighborhood, as was mentioned earlier, why not mandate 100% deep affordability on all publicly owned land to be built by nonprofit entities like municipalities, nonprofits, and community land trusts? What I'm about to say, I don't mean it with any disrespect, but I have to say it. I am also deeply concerned about this commission seeming to be in conflict with earlier charter changes proposed by the City Council. We are at a critical moment for New York City, where our corrupt mayor is doing the bidding of Donald Trump. This is the wrong time to approve charter ballot proposals that undermine the authority of the City Council at the behest of the discredited Mayor Adams. Permanent changes to our city charter should be undertaken co-equally with the City Council, should not be politicized, and should include robust community engagement and voter education. One meeting per borough is not nearly enough. I have enough concerns about this to sincerely believe that the members of this commission should consider stepping down rather than enabling Mayor Adams any further. And again, I mean that with no disrespect. I mean that respectfully. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Ms. Dubnow? Okay, next we'll hear from Sarah Prinsley. And just to be ready, Sarah will be followed by Dean Rossow and then Maria Danzillo. Sarah Prinsley.
Hi, sorry. If you could unmute Dean Rosso, I think that might be, well, it's a better, can you guys see me now?
We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, hang on a second. You can't see me?
We can hear you though. So.
Okay. Well, I apologize that you can't see me. I'm actually on Dean's computer as well. I just wanted to show up on the screen with my name too. But I'm here actually to talk about open primaries. And first of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of open primaries. I had to look up actually what the CRC was, and I was excited to learn that you guys are a committee that is basically organized to be able to have the city's municipal government more transparent and responsive to the needs of the city's residents. And I can tell you that the needs of the city residents really resonated with me, because that's exactly what I think open primaries will do. And just to give you some data, and I know we've heard from different people who have spoke tonight, and so much of it resonated with me. But just to give you some idea of different statistics, people who have chosen not to register with a political party are now the second largest voting group in New York State after Democrats. And this trend is also felt in our city as a growing number of young people and those who are disillusioned with establishment politics are deciding not to pledge their allegiance to political parties. These parties that have started to reflect little nuance or common sense in their policies, and they continue to use issues in the city as election talking points versus actually solving the issues. And because New York is a Democrat-run city, rather, primary elections are the most important elections in our city. Yet, over 1 million independent registered New York City voters are not allowed to vote in them, even though their taxes pay for these actual elections. These voters deserve a say in shaping the policies that affect their daily lives. If the city council can pass a law that would allow non-citizens to vote in elections to ensure that their voices are heard, at the very least, we should allow all registered American citizen voters to vote in New York City primaries. Simply put, open primaries will allow all registered New York City voters' voices to be heard, and their representatives will understand more of what their actual constituents really want versus a vocal minority that currently controls the primary process. And that's why I'm spending my time tonight to testify to urge you to please include open primaries on the ballot in 2025. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time and your testimony. Next, we'll hear from Dean Rosso, again followed by Maria Dandillo, Theodore Crombie. Mr. Rosso, please continue.
Okay.
Hello. Nice to see everyone. I hope you can hear me okay.
If you can.
Hands up? Yeah? Okay, good. Thank you. So my name is Dean Rosso. I live in Manhattan, and I'm here to testify for open primaries. Open primaries will actually benefit the politicians in office by ensuring that they understand the needs of the majority of their constituents, not just the most vocal activists in their party. For politicians to even get elected, they would need votes from a wider range of voters, including moderates and independents, rather than just the most progressive wing of their party. As someone who believes in fiscal responsibility, public safety, and sensible government, I want to see candidates representing a broader coalition, not just those catering to their party fringe. I also believe it will incentivize politicians to get things done instead of using some of the pressing issues we have in our city just to get votes. Open primaries can and will bring much needed reform. It will give every New York City voter an opportunity to choose who they want to represent them. So I wanted to share that with everybody. And then just on another note, I've been living in Manhattan for about 8 years, and I can't go out of my house and go for a walk without smelling pot constantly. I find it really offensive. I hope that you all or people that you're in touch with can do something about that. so that we're not all exposed to what's become almost like incredible to go for a simple walk and get fresh air, enjoy even the parks, and everywhere you go, you're smelling pot.
Thank you. Thank you, so any questions for Sarah and Dean? All right, next we'll hear from Maria Dandillo, followed by Theodore Cronby and Yatsu Chu.
Hi, good evening. Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to testify and for working so late tonight. And thank you to our mayor for allowing this beautiful democracy in action to take place, where you're actually hearing from New Yorkers and voters on things that will make our city better. So just wanted to say how much I personally support this process and support our duly elected mayor's empowerment of all of you to work with the voters. My name is Maria Danslow, and I'm Executive Director of One City Rising. We are a bipartisan citywide good government reform group. We have thousands of members around the city, and we're growing every day. Our One City Rising supporters support open primaries as a reform that is desperately needed to franchise every voter in this city. And I'm happy to join so many voices tonight in support of open primaries. I'm really impressed with the people who were testifying tonight and happy to join them. It's wonderful. I'm a former candidate for city council, and I was not an experienced politician when I first entered the city council race during the pandemic. And the thing that I learned is that so few people were actually going to be participating in the election of our city council representative. And that in itself was a really shocking moment for me to learn that a very, very small number of people were actually able to choose who was going to represent the district, like something like 10 or 12% of the people who live in the district, because so many people weren't registered as Democrats. I'm from the Upper West Side. I'm a lifelong New Yorker, lived on the West Side for 45 years. And very few people in my neighborhood were actually going to be choosing who was going to represent us, because they either weren't registered as Democrats or they were independent. And it was at that time that I knew that open primaries was something that we were going to need to really look at and consider. And I'm so happy that good government groups around the city have coalesced to try to bring open primaries to our voters. New York City needs to join with the vast majority of the country's largest cities and over 70% of the states in the United States, and come out of the dark ages that we're in and into a true voter rights reform era. We need to adopt open primaries, and we hope this commission will get behind that and be able to empower more than 1 million voters in New York City, including up to 700,000 veterans. The idea that 700,000 veterans in our city can't vote in our elections that are critical to determining who wins is just, as the daughter of someone who was in the military for 14 years, is something I find really offensive. So the reality is that our political system, as it works in New York, is where the primaries, the winner is chosen. So the November election is really an afterthought. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have such low voter turnout. I think people are just, disengaged with the voting process if they're not registering in the primaries. So I think open primaries will help to empower more voters. So these 1 million voters are independents, and they really need to be participating in our election. Am I out of time? Anyway, that's it. I can wrap up, but thank you very much, and I appreciate the chance to speak tonight. And thank you for working on this.
Any questions? No, great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Next up, we have Theodore Cronby, who will be followed by Yatsen Chu and Dina Saunders. Okay, so next up is Yatsen Chu. Forgive me if I mispronounce your name.
Good evening. Thank you for having me, and thank you for staying late to hear our testimony. My name is Yatin Chu. I am president of Asian Wave Alliance. We're a nonpartisan political club advocating for the Asian community, and we support open primaries. I am asking the Charter Revision Commission to put open primary on the November 2025 ballot. Our local elections are consequential to the daily lives of New Yorkers. Laws and resources that govern our public safety, transportation, schools, and businesses. All voters should have a say, not just ones who want to register with a party. As we know, New York City leaders are often decided in the Democratic primary. This leaves many voters, especially independents, without a say. This exclusion discourages voter participation and limits the diversity of perspectives in our political discourse. Closed primaries hurt the Asian community, where many are new to democracy and for a variety of reasons are not registered with a party. In District 1, which is Lower Manhattan and Chinatown, 1/4 of the voters are independent or not affiliated with a party. In City Council District 20, which is Flushing, Queens, we have the highest population of Asians at 72%. And in District 43, the newly created Majority Asian District in South Brooklyn, 1/3 of the voters in these districts are independents or unaffiliated with a party. New York City's closed primaries disenfranchises the Asian community and silences our representation in local elections. Open primaries will give working class and marginalized communities who may not fit neatly into the two-party structure a greater voice in choosing candidates who represent our needs. That's why I hope the commission would seriously consider adding a measure for open primaries to the ballot in 2025. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions? Next, we will hear from Zena Saunders, who will be followed by John Johnston and Jeffrey Aaron. Zena Saunders.
I think Theodore is there.
I'm sorry, did I skip? Sorry.
Theodore.
All right, we can go back to Theodore Crombie, so Theodore will be followed by Zena Saunders.
Yeah, terribly sorry for the mix-up there. Okay, this works now. Sorry, couldn't change my name. Hello, I'm Theodore Crombie. I'm a sophomore at Hunter College High School in New York and a strategy intern for Unite New York. I'll keep this brief. I'm conscious that my speech could push back those of speakers older and wiser than me. As a student, I've learned that the characteristics of successful democratic systems include being inclusive in my classes. I believe that putting open primaries on the ballot in 2025 would make New York's system more inclusive. This ballot initiative has the opportunity to increase voter engagement and turnout by making primary elections more representative of New Yorkers. For example, in the 8 years following California's implementation of open primaries, minority legislative caucuses grew by up to 50%. I, alongside the rest of my generation, am eager to participate in New York City's government. Barriers to participation, like closed primaries, discourage us before we even cast our first ballot. Thus, I'm testifying before you today and urge you to put open primaries on the ballot this year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Theodore. Oh, I had a question from Theodore. Get it back. Is Theodore back? Yeah. Peter, thank you so much for your testimony. It's really appreciate you joining us. And I'm curious whether your proposal would apply across city council elections as well, or are you primarily focused on citywide elections?
Yeah, so to my knowledge, the proposal is centered specifically on citywide elections, and whether or not that would apply to city council elections specifically could be evaluated later on.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for participating. I appreciate it. Next up, we have Zena Saunders, followed by John Johnston and Jeffrey Aaron. So Zena Saunders. Nina going once, twice. All right, next, John Johnston. Well, John, all right, so next up will be Jeffrey Aaron, followed by Linda DeGusta. Jeffrey Aaron.
Hi, my name is Jeff Aaron. I live in Manhattan. Thank you so much for hosting these meetings. I'm very pleased to be able to participate. I want to say how excited I am. I guess I'm not surprised, though, that so many people have testified as I am on behalf of open primaries. Most of the people that I'm speaking with are upset about the fact that they can't vote and that the people who do vote in primaries consist of 5%, maybe 10% of the general population, and that ends up determining who citywide, as well as more local candidates are. I just wanted to say, since everybody has been so eloquent, in the lead up, in the past month or so, I've been getting call after call from people saying, oh, you got to change your registration from independent so that you're going to have a chance to vote in the mayoral primaries, because you know that whoever ends up voting in the, wins the mayoral primary in June, they're going to end up being the mayor. So if you want to have a voice, you have to vote in the Democratic primary, switch your registration. The kind of blackmail and heavy-handed persuasion that takes my vote for granted, my principles, my values, and says lie in order to be able to participate in this democracy really offends me. The fact that my tax dollars goes to support Democratic and Republican primaries and doesn't include million people who would like to vote and don't have the opportunity seems so, taxation without representation, that just seems so unfair. And other cities and states around the country have managed to figure out how to deal with this. But in New York City, as someone said, the institution that really dominates is not so much, yes, the real estate industry is a problem, but the Democratic Party won't give up the democratic right of all people in the city to vote. But that's not just true in New York City, that's true in cities and states around the country. There's a lot of anger out here, and there's a lot of support, as you can tell from this testimony. And you're contributing to a really bad situation in our country, what we have now in our country, this disillusion, and among young people. Most young people are registering as independents. What are they supposed to do in this coming election? If they want to participate, what are young people going to do?
Thank you. I want to thank you. So we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for your
Thank you.
passion. I appreciate it. Next up is Linda DeGusta, followed by Alex Protopopoulos and Frank Moreno. So Linda DeGusta.
Okay, I'm here now. I'm not on camera. I'm just on voice. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. My name is Linda. I live in Manhattan and participate in the activities of Unite New York. I would love to see open primaries on the ballot and, of course, adopted. We are now the only ranked choice voting jurisdiction that does not hold open primaries. Fact is, we need people to vote. Right now, we shut out at least 1 million people from primaries, and the general election presents inadequate options as a result. It's time to engage more voters with an inclusive, dynamic, and engaging process, beginning with an open primary and carrying through to the general election. I hope and believe that opening the primaries can be a learning tool to move us in the direction of real dialogue across party lines and heal the rift that we see now, rather than continue in the direction of a society that is pathologically partisan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the sentiments and your birthday. I appreciate it. Next, we will hear from Alex Papas, followed by Frank Morano and Howard Levy.
Yeah, hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. So I think a lot of the other speakers in favor of open primaries have very eloquently articulated their positions and, have cited some very important statistics. For example, the fact that a lot of the general elections are not competitive at all. So rather than going over some of that, I'd like to add some other facts. So one of the previous speakers mentioned that if you want to change your party affiliation, you have to do so by February 14th. And I think that's one of the things that sort of indicates just how flawed our system is right now, because it's actually even worse than that. When you change your party affiliation, um, you're committed to vote in that party's primaries for the rest of the year, right? So there might be a primary in June, there might be another one in September, but you can't change your party affiliation after that. You can only change it once a year. So that's one thing that people haven't brought up, which I think is particularly unfair. The other thing which I'd also like to mention is I also feel that the way that the closed primary works is unfair to a lot of new Americans. So, for example, my immigrant mother, when she became a citizen, she was asking me what this registration thing was all about, and I told her, well, look, you have to decide what the dominant party is in your town, and you should register with them. But she said, well, I don't know if I always want to vote for Democrat. I want to be able to vote for whoever I want. And that was a really big deal for her because in her youth, she lived in a country that at that time had a dictatorship. So she really valued democracy. And it took me a lot of convincing to tell her that she could still vote for whoever she wanted in the general election. So I think this is somewhat unfair to our newest citizens because it's not really clear what this registration thing is all about to a lot of people. And then the last thing that I want to mention is I know that nationwide, a majority of veterans are actually registered independents, and I think some other speakers mentioned this, but it's worth mentioning again that I think people who've kind of put their lives on the line to defend democracy should have a say in it. And that's pretty much it. I don't think I have anything new to say beyond that. So thank you for taking the time to receive citizen feedback.
Thank you so much, and thank you for taking the time this evening to be with us. We appreciate it. Next up will be Frank Morano, who'll be followed by Howard Levy and Seth Radwell.
Good evening, Commissioners. It's great to be here. I know you've had a long night, so I promise not to prolong it too much. I want to thank you for your service, and I want to give a special acknowledgement to somebody that makes Staten Island proud every day in city government, but especially on this commission, Diane Savino, who's a good friend and who I've learned more about city government and state government just listening to her complain about what's wrong than I've learned in years of studying it on my own. I'm here primarily to testify in favor of nonpartisan elections. One, I'm actually a candidate in a nonpartisan election on Staten Island now, and I participated in nonpartisan elections as a volunteer, as a political activist. This is the first time I've participated as a candidate, and it's wonderful. And I think it's important to keep in mind that New York City has had nonpartisan elections for 32 years. This is not some novel, new conceit that we're trying to totally upset the apple cart. We've had nonpartisan elections, both Democrats and Republicans, and even a couple of independents have gotten elected. And they've worked really well. So what I'm urging the commission to put on the ballot is just give the voters the opportunity to give people the same opportunity that I have right now to reach out to all voters, not a narrow slice of the Republican Party or Democratic Party. And it's a great experience because you don't have to skip houses when you're campaigning based on who's a Democrat, who's a Republican. You go out and meet every voter, which is how it should be. It puts every voter in a position where their vote really matters. Additionally, additionally, when we talk about nonpartisan elections, the reason it's so important is because right now you have taxpayers that are forced to pay for elections that they can't participate in. One of the other people mentioned the phrase taxation without representation. I seem to have heard that somewhere else before. I don't remember where, but it sounds great. And that's exactly what we need to put an end to. There should be no opportunity to have people pay for elections that they can't even participate in. The last thing I'll mention is that I think it's important to distinguish the issue of open primaries for nonpartisan elections. I think a lot of people who are well-intentioned are commingling those two terms, and that can be very messy because the Supreme Court has defined different types of primaries in a few of their decisions, and there are political science textbooks that define each one. They all agree on definition. An open primary is a type of partisan primary in which each party has its own primary ballot and its own nominees, but on primary day, any voter can choose any party's primary ballot. Most southern states have that. And in open primary states, most registration forms don't ask the voter to choose a party. For example, Texas has open primaries. Therefore, George Bush or Ted Cruz is not a registered Republican because he lives in Texas, and there are no registered Republicans or Democrats in Texas. Given that New York has statewide party registration, I don't think that would work well. A nonpartisan election is like what I'm in, where parties are not involved. Instead, individuals run against each other purely as individuals, or as New York City has it, with a made-up party label. Open primary has nothing in common with nonpartisan elections. As Mayor LaGuardia said, there's no Democratic or Republican way to clean a street. Let's allow all of the candidates for every municipal office to put our records, our ideas, and our vision for the future of New York City before the voters, and let's have them vote not because we have an R next to our name or a D next to our name, but because we have the best qualifications and the best vision for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Senator Savino's clapping for you. I appreciate it.
Can't even vote for it.
Next up will be Howard Levy, followed by Seth Radwell, and our final testimony will be from Bridget Fox.
Hi, thank you, everyone. And I apologize for lying down. My back hurts. I mean, no disrespect to the commission. I'm here to talk about open primaries. You've heard a lot of the information before. I'm a New Yorker. I'm married. I have 2 kids. We live in New York, and we're part of the fabric of society, and we like our votes to be heard, along with the million other people who cannot vote in one party or the other's primaries. Look, there's a huge mistrust in government right now. That's a problem. We need to have as much participation as possible. You heard from the gentleman at Citizens United about the low participation rates in New York City, kind of constantly declining over the decades. This is not a good sign. You've heard from others about, like, Curtis Sliwa getting fewer votes than say Ms. Garcia, and still, being on the general election ballot. But the ranked choice voting is good, by the way, as well. But so I'll just kind of say, in terms of open primaries, people who have matter of views should be able to have a say, in what happens. So I'm for open primaries for people, regardless of their political or party affiliation, to participate. And let's open up the election process. Let's have more accountability. Let's get the extremes out of the system so that we could have a more moderate voice and not the kowtowing to the left or the right. And let's increase the participation in elections overall. So thank you, and respectfully urge the commission to consider open primaries to be added to the 2025 ballot so we can have more inclusive political representation. Thank you.
Next is Seth Radwell, and followed by Bridget Fox. Next will be Seth Radwell, followed by Bridget Fox.
She was after that, Bridget?
Bridget, so be Bridget.
Oh, Bridget.
Bridget Fox.
Oh, Bridget.
I want to thank everyone for testifying and being here. The next public hearing of the commission will be. The next public hearing of the commission will be held in the Bronx on March 4th at 5 p.m. at Fordham University, the McShane Campus Center, the Great Hall on the 3rd floor, located at 441 East Fordham Road. Is there a motion to adjourn? May I have a second? Any discussion? All in favor? We adjourn. Thank you so much.